In today's episode, we welcome back Dr. Jen Gunter,
Why was menstruation so different?
obstetrician and gynecologist, to chat about the science, medicine, and mythology of menstruation, the focus of her new book, Blood.
Her brand new book, Blood.
You say at the beginning, the menstrual cycle is the wheel that drives humanity.
That's a good line, isn't it?
It's a great line.
Jen
My goal is not make anybody love their menstrual cycle. I just want people to understand it.
In this conversation, we discuss what the menstrual cycle is.
Basically getting rid of that deciduous. If you have an incredibly invasive placenta, it is the stuff of surgical nightmares.
Menstrual cycle
You know, I've
myths,
heard that tomatoes can cause a solar eclipse. Really, I've heard that.
what a regular menstrual cycle looks like, PMS versus PMDD, how the pill affects the menstrual cycle, whether emergency contraception like Plan B and Ella is safe, abortion, and much more.
Gosh, I think we could end breast cancer if every woman ran a Dutch test.
Well, I can understand how a chiropractor wouldn't know about medications because they don't learn about them in chiropractic school. If we really needed the menstrual cycle to dump things, how could people survive pregnancy? How could they survive menopause? Oh my God, I should be dead. I would say that's a stunning display of ignorance. And sadly, we see people coming in who need hormones to protect their uterus, who won't take it because of stuff they hear online.
Please enjoy. This is my conversation with Dr. Jen Gunter. We might be live next time, Jen.
Wow. Well, only if it's like at a resort in Bali or something.
Okay, leave it with us. We're always happy to have you back with us. So thank you for making the trip down and doing this. I'm excited.
I'm going to try to be nicer because apparently there's a whole Reddit page dedicated to how much of a bitch I am. I'm like,
Why do I feel like you would, of all people, might see that as a compliment?
it's really amazing to me. You know, there aren't pages dedicated to male educators about, you know, how awful they are, right? You know, it's all women commenting on it. It's really interesting, you know.
Do you take that stuff personally?
No, I don't. I just think it's really sad where people think that that criticizing Andrew Huberman makes me a bitch. It's like, really? That's kind of a big, you know, this is a person who's, you know, literally, you know, making stuff up and selling you stuff to, you know, fund whatever. And, you know, you point that out and you're the bad person. It's really interesting.
Why do you think, do you think people see you as polarizing?
Yeah, I think some people do, which I find fascinating because I'm just like not going to back down when I have a correct opinion. And, you know, if you want to believe your pseudoscience and be in a cult, I mean, I'm not going to say that's okay. I mean, okay, you know, you live your life, but I'm not going to change my opinion to make you feel more comfortable.
Why do you, what's your objective here? I think from the outside, people might think, why put yourself through that? Why subject yourself to so much criticism? Why not just, you know, go down your own path and sell something?
Well, I don't have any interest in selling a product. So that's not, you know, I don't have any interest in that at all. Because I see people who are harmed by the disinformation every single day. You know, I see people coming in taking 15 supplements that can't possibly help them, who have spent thousands, if not $10,000s of dollars, and, you know, or people who've seen doctors and had surgical procedures that couldn't possibly help them. And I don't know, I just think that's really sad. And I think that if you have an opportunity to speak up and people are listening, shouldn't you do that?
Yeah, I think last time we connected, we spoke about the gaps in medicine and how that can kind of leave the door ajar,
right,
for someone who wants to take advantage, I guess, of your vulnerability.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of that. I mean, it's really sad that these gaps exist, and it's really sad that people take advantage of them. And I don't think sort of gaps and people taking advantage is anything new. I'm pretty sure that's been going on, you know, since the beginning of time. And we see that probably in lots of areas of life, right? But yeah, I think that it's really interesting how in many ways the internet is just making things a lot worse. Because especially I think sort of the reels, people get sucked into the content and then the algorithm just pushes people down a certain way. And, you know, I see people come into the office with completely incorrect understanding of how, you know, what aspect of their body works, like just completely not knowing. And, you know, they're not a doctor, they shouldn't know, but that's what they learned from social media, right?
They fell into that echo chamber,
right?
Which then, like, it's not their fault. That almost intentionally warps their reality.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think the predators who create those, who exploit the gaps are the bad people, right? But in many ways, when you try to explain to someone, no one wants to hear they've been scammed, right? Because we all want to think we're smarter than that. So I think when you point out, how incorrect that is, I think that gets a lot of people's hackles up.
Right.
So I think there's
You're almost taking a shot at their intelligence.
Well, yeah, but you know what? I mean, if somebody did that to me about something to do with cars, I would, I don't know anything about cars or computers. I got tricked by an internet scam, a month ago because I didn't know the way it was all done was just so slick. Someone who knew a ton about internet scams was like, oh, this is a red flag, this is a red flag, and this is a red flag. But since it was a brand new scam, didn't know about those things. It's very easy to get tricked.
So from your perspective, the antidote to, I guess, misinformation or disinformation, at least the part that you play, is education. So I'm reading between the lines, but you kind of write about this in your book as well, your new book, that through education, you're hoping to empower people so that they feel more confident in the decisions that they're making about their health, and they're less likely, I guess, to fall victim to some of that misinformation.
Yeah. I mean, the way I think about it is, if you know that turmeric supplements are associated with liver failure, if they can be contaminated with lead, and there's no convincing evidence they actually can do anything for you health-wise, and you still want to take it, well, you made an informed choice. It's not a choice I would make. I mean, there's people who climb buildings, without parachutes. There's people who do all kinds of risky behaviors or things that I wouldn't do. If you know the risks, it's your body and your choice. My concern is that they haven't been given the information, so they're not making an informed choice. If you're told that turmeric is safe and effective and can help you with weight loss, you've been misled. So you haven't made that decision from a position of knowledge.
In your book, you say the practice of viewing female physiology as toxic throughout the ages has left a damaging legacy of inadequate research, dismissal by a patriarchal medical system, an uncaring society, and insufficient education about how the female body works. What are the societal and individual consequences of that?
Well, I think, first of all, it's people not knowing how their body works, not having any education. I wouldn't say any, obviously people have some, but when we can't have non-sophomoric discussions about physiology in schools, when we have to separate boys and girls, when we talk about these things in ways that they're dirty or use pejorative terms, then people start to think their body is dirty. Where do you go to ask questions about something that's dirty or shameful, right? Maybe you shouldn't even ask a question. So it leads people, I think one of the big consequences, it leads people to just turn inwards, right? So they have shame, or they don't know where to turn. Or if they have questions, they don't have a legitimate person to turn to. So, there's this thing called data voids, right? So if I make up a term, if I make up something, I say, oh, you need to do dumbbell kettlebell swings, which are like, I just made that up, right? So if you Google that, you wouldn't find anything. But if I wrote a post about that and made up a whole bunch of stuff and just picked words that sounded like from exercise physiology and from workouts and things like that, that would be the only Google hit you'd get. And then you'd read that and you think, oh, that must be true. So when we have data voids, that also leads people away from good sources of information and to sources that could be, incorrect.
So is there inadequate research when it comes to female physiology, topics like your book on menstruation, and these big glaring sort of gaps in the research? Or is it that there is a lot of information, it's just not finding its way to the public?
Well, I think it's both. So definitely there's massive gaps. And if we go back a little bit in time, obviously in the 1950s and 1960s, research wasn't, done the same way it's done now. And it was just kind of the idea about, testing products and what needs to be regulated. And there'd been several attempts by the FDA about, how you're going to, or what was initially the FDA. I don't remember all the names of the agencies. And then we had thalidomide, right? And so the idea that giving a medication in pregnancy could have absolutely catastrophic consequences all of a sudden became on everybody's mind. And I think this became a very convenient excuse to exclude women from lots of studies. Oh, we can't test our blood pressure medication because you might get pregnant. Oh, we can't test this because you might be pregnant and we don't know. We don't know what the effect it could be.
So is that a fear?
Yeah, well, it was out of fear, but also...
Can you bring us up to speed with that story if someone's not familiar with it?
Oh, with thalidomide, yeah. So thalidomide was... I don't know much about the drug, obviously, because I've never prescribed it, but it was a medication that was given actually for morning sickness during pregnancy. My mother was actually given it. She was back in England. My parents are from England, and she was pregnant with my brother and didn't take it. So she used to, whenever there was a thalidomide story, she would literally have this like stress reaction, which you can kind of understand. And it caused terrible, I believe they're called limb reduction defects. So children were born with no arms and no legs, and often with sort of small appendages at their joints, and just devastating consequences, devastating. And it turns out that if you give thalidomide at a very specific juncture during embryology, you affect the limb buds. If you give it later in the pregnancy, maybe there wouldn't be that effect. But if you give it at that exact wrong time, which is also the time when people have morning sickness, it's a terrible, terrible recipe. And so this wasn't studied adequately. I don't even know how much it was studied at all. And we had this terrible, catastrophe. So that, I think, became an excuse to exclude women from studies, right? So two things can be true. You have to worry about giving people untested medications in pregnancy. But it can also be true that testing women who have a menstrual cycle where hormones change every single day is more complex than studying men who don't have that. So if you're a pharmaceutical company and you're like, hey, I can conveniently exclude the people who are more expensive or more challenging to study, you're going to want to do that. And so there was this, I think, as sort of a change in how we were studying things was happening, the idea that women should be studied as well just was like, well, we can't. And it became a convenient excuse. And then it just continued. And, we saw, very little investment in studying medications for diabetes or high blood pressure, things like that. When you look at, the massive populations of people that were studied initially for statins, so mostly men. And it took, legislation in the United States in 1993 to say, well, if you're going to use federal funds to study something and that drug is applicable for both women and men, you have to have, you have to study both. And so it took, the federal government stepping in because, again, capitalism wants to take the easiest, cheaper route. So there's that. But then in addition, you have the fact that, pain has been underappreciated for women. It's so fascinating. You can either say that, oh, there's awful tropes about women being able to bear more pain because they can have pregnancy, but also women are whiners and complainers, right? So it's sort of, wait a minute, how can you, how does that work? So, the female physiology is, I would say, discussed not appropriately as you see fit, right? You can twist it for whatever you want. So we have these conditions that we started to develop technology to understand. So for example, endometriosis, which is where tissue similar to the lining of the uterus grows outside in the pelvic cavity and may well be a system-wide inflammatory condition. I don't think we really know yet. Or polycystic ovarian syndrome. Both of these affect on average 10%. And depending on the studies, it could be a little bit more, but we'll just say, to make it easy, 10%. So you now have, in the 1970s, you didn't have ultrasounds. You didn't have things that you could use to sort of properly identify these things. But as these tools became developed, the idea that these things merited study just didn't seem to click. So our very first understanding of polycystic ovarian syndrome was basically, well, it's because you're overweight. And, now we know that while being overweight can magnify the symptoms, the incidence is the same. It's not a condition of obesity. It's a medical condition that exists and can be made worse by obesity. And so
you can be a healthy, quote unquote, body weight.
Yeah, you can
normal
have
BMI.
You could have a normal
PCOS.
BMI and have PCOS, absolutely. But then you see, okay, well, people with obesity are going to be overrepresented in studies if they tend to have worse symptoms, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then that also led to people who weren't obese being dismissed, being told you can't possibly have PCOS. So you can see how it can lead to bad care in so many different ways. It can lead to blaming people for their medical condition inappropriately. You should never do that. But biologically, it doesn't even work here. And also lead people to not get a diagnosis. And so, when we first started really, I think, spending money on health for women, it was sort of in the context of maternal and child health. So a lot of money on obstetrics, a lot of money on improving pregnancy outcomes, a lot of money on contraception, all which are important. And I'm not saying that those aren't. But it seemed that the idea of how to improve the lives of women outside of pregnancy or outside of getting pregnant seemed to not really be thought of until relatively recently.
Are women or females, people with a female reproductive system, we can talk about language at some point in this conversation, are they particularly vulnerable to misinformation?
Well, I think when you look at, you have half the population who's more economically disadvantaged, right? So, there's that. So you have economic disadvantage. If you're looking in, places where, if you're more likely to be a single parent, you have more financial strain, you have less time. So you have all these other factors that might contribute. You have glass ceilings. You have the fact that women are more likely to end up doing emotional labor in relationships. There's a fascinating study that looks at in a heterosexual relationship, even when men and women are doing the same number of hours per week, the men are doing more of the fun stuff, right? So you look at things like unequal division of labor and all these things, those create strain. And I think all of those factors can become additive in a way that can make it harder. Maybe it's harder for you to have time to go to the medical provider. Maybe it's harder for you to pay for your medications. Maybe you go and you can't afford to travel for the referral, and then you add in on top, of course, in the United States, abortion restrictions, and you add in that women are even being, turned away from getting appropriate care because, people are afraid of being arrested for, doing an abortion. People who are miscarrying can't even go in and get the medication in some of these states to help them complete their miscarriage. So, and people are even being arrested. So I think that there's a lot of different sort of levels of inequality. So, and when there's inequality, you're more likely to be taken advantage of, you're more likely to suffer.
There's a lot for us to kind of dive into today and get the listeners across. And we've spoken about the menstrual cycle a little bit. We spoke about the pill or oral contraception a little bit, but I want to dive in a little deeper to both of those, to emergency contraception or the morning after pill, I guess it's called,
right.
Plan B, abortion, which you just mentioned, all of these things. But perhaps we can start at the surface. Really, I guess part of the rationale for this new book, you say at the beginning, the menstrual cycle is the wheel that drives humanity. Why is the menstrual cycle so critical, so important to all life?
Right. That's a good line, isn't it?
It's a great line.
My publisher was like, ooh, that's a good starter. So it's menstruation is really fascinating. So there are only 5 species with a menstrual cycle. So, there's humans and many primates. There's bats. There's the spiny mouse, or some bats, the spiny mouse and the elephant shrew. It's sort of like this, like weird superhero, collection. I imagine them all like appearing, and then we're going to go fight crime with menstruation or something. And how did they figure out bats menstruate? Anyway, it's like, really? So menstruation is like everything in our bodies, part of resource curation and turning, everything into the next generation, right? Everything is here to make the next generation, whether you're a plant, whether you're a bacteria, whether you're a human, whether you're a giraffe. And, different species, different animals, different taxa, I guess, come up with that in different ways. And so the menstrual cycle is a really fascinating way to to ensure that human pregnancies go as planned. So human pregnancies, human embryos are incredibly invasive. They want to burrow right deep into the uterus because they want to get oxygen. They want to make contact with maternal blood vessels. If you want to grow big brains, you need lots of oxygen, right? So when I say the wheel that drives humanity, well, you know what? If we didn't have these super invasive placentas, maybe we wouldn't be able to have grown these big brains, so we wouldn't be able to do all these amazing things with the big brains, right? So if you have an incredibly invasive placenta, if it's just left on its own, that's going to grow like a cancer. It's going to grow into organs. It's going to grow through the uterus. In fact, we see that condition called placenta precreta, and it's catastrophic when the system goes awry. And when the placenta grows through the uterus and attaches to the bowel and the liver, it is the stuff of surgical nightmares. Those are the kinds of things where you can exhaust a blood bank. You can literally run out of blood. So one way to help manage that is to have a thick uterine lining, kind of like a catcher's mitt, ready for the embryo. I'm going to handle it. We're going to, give it this kind of like soft landing. I mean, it's just an analogy, but you get what I speak. So it's got, there's immune factors. There's all these other factors that are going to help slow down and contain the embryo implantation. So that's one thing that thickened uterine lining does. The other thing that thickened uterine lining does is actually helps regulate what gets implanted and what doesn't. So many people have heard the phrase that 70% of human conceptions don't make it. They end in miscarriage. Some of those fail even before implantation, but some fail very early with very early implantation, meaning that the miscarriage, if you will, has occurred around the time of the next period. So you don't even know that you were pregnant. And this is basically resource curation. The endometrium, this thickened endometrium, has immunological sensors, and it can actually mount an immune response with an abnormal pregnancy and trigger menstruation. And there are other things that this thickened endometrium can do. So the way we get that thickened, specialized endometrium is with ovulation. So if you start at the beginning of the menstrual cycle, you start to release estrogen. And the estrogen thickens the lining of the uterus, gets it ready for implantation. When you ovulate, you release large amounts of the hormone progesterone. And that causes the lining of the uterus to undergo an irreversible change called decidualization. And that's often a new word for people. And it's really converting one tissue into another. It's converting that thickened lining of the uterus into this special tissue that can control the embryo, that can mount an immune response, that's going to help that, with the early placentation.
Is that the phase there during ovulation where a person is most likely to fall pregnant?
Yes. So you need decidualization to be pregnant. So after ovulation, there is a very relatively short time window where the decidua is ready. It's ready for implantation. If it doesn't happen in that time, it's unlikely to occur. So you have this thickened, specialized uterine lining. Well, say pregnancy doesn't happen. So there is a couple of options. The body could reabsorb that tissue. The body can jettison it, or the body could build a new lining on top of it. You can't build a new lining on top of that thickened endometrium. You need the blood vessels, you need to get back to basics or baseline. You can't absorb it because it's become tissue at this point. It's not just a few layers of cells, it's sort of thickened tissue. So the only way to start anew is to dump it. And so that's what menstruation is. When there's no placenta, so when there's an implantation, there's signals to go to the corpus luteum to say, hey, keep producing the progesterone. There's a placenta on its way. You just need to hang out for a bit longer. But without those signals, the corpus luteum runs out of gas, basically, and stops producing progesterone. And it's that withdrawal of progesterone that triggers the inflammatory chemical cascade that triggers menstruation. And so that's what the menstrual cycle is. So it's part of having that specialized endometrium that is so vital to having human pregnancies.
Right. So this is evolution's way of increasing the chance that humans will survive as a species and can procreate. So this is kind of like ground zero. essentially.
Yeah, I mean, evolution doesn't have any plans. It's just kind of whatever works out, right? But
Sure,
yeah,
for lack of a better
yeah,
word.
exactly.
Yeah.
So there's always somebody who's like, well, that's not good. I'm just like, well, it's an analogy. You got to go with it. So yeah, so just it's a way that helps to curate the resources, because a human pregnancy is the most metabolically taxing thing besides breastfeeding that a human can do. Right. So I've heard it equated with the metabolic demands of pregnancy are on par with cycling the Tour de France or with running a marathon every day for like a year. Like, it's a massive metabolic challenge, right, to the body. So, yeah, when are you more likely to have a successful pregnancy? When, you don't want to use, or you don't want to use those resources for something that isn't going to have a chance of, getting to the next generation, right?
So if someone is thinking, okay, I understand the importance of the menstrual cycle, but let's say that there's someone who has been, I think you put it as a source of aggravation, pain, and suffering. They're thinking, how can this be so beneficial from an evolutionary perspective, so favorable, yet my N=1 experience in my 20s is horrible?
Right. So evolution, can I swear?
You can do whatever you want on this show.
Okay. Evolution doesn't give a shit about individual trauma or carnage. It doesn't. Well, evolution obviously doesn't think, but it doesn't matter. It matters for the group. Does this work for the group? I always think of evolution as patching you up, putting some duct tape on the holes and putting you out the door and going, good enough. I mean, that's really what it is. We have this idea that is often presented to us by wellness, that the human body, if left to its own devices, would be perfect, right? That nature is in harmony. And this is, an old belief from the 1700s and much earlier, where religion and medicine were the same. That's why wellness uses the language of purity culture. They're tying into that same sort of religion and medicine that existed before germ theory. So nature is not perfect. Nature's like, good enough, so that's really what it is. And so it's important for people to understand that this isn't perfect. This is just good enough.
Right. So evolution is more concerned with your ability to survive and procreate, pass on your genetics, as opposed to how optimized you are or how much you're thriving.
Yeah. Optimization has nothing to do with evolution, which is sort of fascinating given how, I think people are, some people are obsessed with the concept of optimization. So it's really just about, is this good enough to get the next generation? And then over tens of thousands of years, there might be other changes that happen as different traits become, more or less, effective for passing on genetics. It's all about passing on genetics, because it's not just the metabolic toll of being pregnant and breastfeeding. You also have to survive, childbirth, and you have to raise a child until it's old enough to eat and care for itself. So the biological investment, the energy required to raise a child to the point where they can then look after themselves, to care for, to then get to the point where they can pass on their own genetics, is pretty significant. So it makes sense to have a system that is trying to limit, or it makes sense that the successful system limits spending energy where it's not needed.
That kind of scenario that I described before, someone in their 20s or 30s who is suffering, and I want to get into like what some of that suffering might look like, or what their experience could be like. Is that something you come across often, that it's almost like a love-hate relationship with their menstrual cycle? They obviously, well, not obviously, but they probably, I'm assuming here, value its role in reproduction. Perhaps they want to have kids later in life, but it's taxing. And are you hoping through your book and education that you're helping people kind of better appreciate or love the menstrual cycle more?
No, my goal is to not make anybody love their menstrual cycle. I just want people to understand it, because I think that knowledge provides a certain freedom. So there are people who are devastated by their menstrual cycle for many reasons. Maybe they suffer with terrible pain, or they're suffering with polycystic ovarian syndrome, or they have terrible premenstrual dysphoric disorder, or they've had catastrophic outcomes in pregnancy, or, there's all kinds of reasons. So I don't ever want to dismiss any of that, carnage, or the fact that society is often very uncaring about those things. And that in an awful sort of way, many women are still judged by, their reproductive fitness, if you will. So I think all of that is complicated and awful for a lot of people. And I think that we can hold space for people who think that their menstrual cycle is beautiful and amazing. We can hold space for people who think it's awful and terrible. I just don't want people to be colored by society's views. Your own personal experiences, absolutely. But if you also grow up in a society that tells you you're dirty and gross because of menstruation, that's going to color your view of your body, right?
Where does that stem from, that a woman who has her period is kind of tainted or dirty? I was in Bali recently, and there was like a welcome ceremony, and one of the things that kind of surprised me, and this is not to disrespect or throw shade on any culture, I was just surprised that there was a kind of request, if a woman was on her period, to sit out. She wasn't able to be blessed. And
right.
In preparation for this conversation, that kind of memory came back, and I was thinking, where does that stem from?
The patriarchy. Yeah, I don't support. I think whether it's from religion or, it's all patriarchy. It's from a lack of knowledge and lack of understanding. And I think that any societal practice that excludes half the population for being dirty, or can't be blessed, or can't make meals in their own home, or can't go to temple, or can't have sex with their husband, you can put can't because you're dirty. That's a way to oppress half the population. So, as I'm speaking as an atheist, so I don't have, the trappings of, different religions, and I can also hold space for people get to view it how they want to. But the idea that your physiology should make you lesser, should make you undesirable, should make you less of a productive member of society is simply a tool of oppression. What message does that send to girls when we say that your menstrual cycle is dirty or toxic? They grow up believing that something that happens to you, makes you think your body is wrong. And it's so bizarre to me that you can think that, and many people do. This is not a single cultural experience at all. This happens all around the world. Is how you can think that and yet think that this person can also be pregnant and produce the next generation, right? The idea that you're going to grow a fetus in a toxic swill, that your body is too toxic to be blessed, but it's okay to have a baby. So, these are things that I just find very troubling. And again, I'm not an anthropologist. I'm not a sociologist. I'm just speaking as someone who thinks that any language that makes women lesser is problematic.
How do we square that with language used to describe some of these things? So there's a quite a big, I guess, debate almost in the medical field, or maybe outside of the medical field. But I have read some articles, one that's here, around whether you should refer to someone as a person who menstruates, or is it a woman that menstruates? I think I've listened to kind of both sides, and I think there's good points on both, and it's incredibly tricky. And to your point there about feeling lesser than or marginalized or oppressed, what I've heard from women who are sort of against using people who menstruate, that type of language, is that they feel like they have fought so hard to get their identity, and not referring to them as women is, they're kind of losing their dignity.
So I think context matters a fair bit. And so obviously if you're talking about maybe the context of how women are oppressed by a particular religion, well, those people are being oppressed because in general because they look like a woman and because they are signaling to that religion a very specific thing. And to take that and then apply that to the way we educate people medically or talk about things, I think that we can have laws that can be inclusive for everybody who needs to be protected, because there are people who are women who don't menstruate, for example. So we don't want to tie menstruation to the concept of being a woman because, well, you have a hysterectomy. You're still a woman. I'm in menopause. I'm still a woman. And so I think that it kind of gets a bit bogged down where we have to have these sort of when people are getting kind of, I guess, like upset about including more people, because in general, the more inclusive you are, the better for society. So, I can hold a place for talking about the importance of the rights for women to vote. I think that's a great example. And also writing a book and trying to use the language person when I'm talking about how to educate people. Because, first of all, women are people. So that's a pretty good default term. I don't like using terms like menstruator or uterus haver because, again, to me, that actually feels kind of patriarchal, distilling people to body parts. And also that language doesn't really work because, again, you can not have a uterus and have ovaries and ovulate. You can have your uterus and ovaries removed and still be a woman, and you can be a trans woman and not menstruate. So I think that using the term people when we're trying to talk about things medically to be inclusive is super important. And I think it's also important, we can say, women and people who menstruate. We can say people who menstruate. I think the context is a little bit what matters. And I think that when we're trying to talk about public access to services, when we're trying to talk about medicine, we should really be as inclusive as possible. I don't really feel like I lose anything about that. Yeah. But also when I'm talking about history, or when I'm talking about something that happened in the 1600s, you have to use the term that was appropriate for the time. And you want to use the appropriate term would be women. And, I use the word women in the book lots of times. I use the word people in the book lots of times. And so I don't feel like anything's being taken away from me by, having more seats at the table.
Yeah, I think I feel the same way. I was trying to put myself into the shoes of, the person that's reading your book or reading a peer-reviewed paper, and if I read something that said persons with a penis, I have a penis, I wouldn't see that as kind of disrespectful, or I wouldn't feel like I've lost dignity. I would feel that I'm just being treated respectfully and as respectfully as other people who are not identifying as men that also have penises.
Inclusivity usually always results in a net positive. And I think it's also important for people to know that a lot of the, I would say, like hatred or vitriol that comes about using inclusive language is often very politically motivated, right? We don't realize how much, we're being manipulated. It's like when you used to see these like whatever demonstrations in, another country on the news, and then you're only seeing that one street where everybody is, and you go one street over and nobody's demonstrating, right? So there's a lot of that. I think that goes along with this. A lot of it's a bit of, I think, much ado about nothing. And how does it hurt me to say people, but it might make somebody who's a person who menstruates feel better. It doesn't hurt me. It doesn't take anything away from me. So I think we can be inclusive, and that's why I just use the term people, because again, it's so kludgy, and I don't personally like distilling people to body parts, but if somebody wants to do that in their book or for them, that's okay too.
Yeah, I think it all comes back to this idea of being marginalized. So if I was to kind of steel man what I just said, then someone might hear that and go, yeah, it's easy for you to say, you're a white male.
Right.
You haven't been marginalized. And I totally get that and appreciate that it's not a like for like comparison. And they may say, well, it's not as important to you because, we've historically been marginalized. So it's a different context.
Yeah. I mean, I would say nobody is losing contraception rights or abortion rights in the United States because of using inclusive language. So what are you actually losing? Would be the thing that I would ask people. What are you losing by having gender inclusive bathrooms? I mean, you have a gender inclusive bathroom at your house. That seems to work okay, right? There's a gender inclusive bathroom on the airplane. that seems to work okay. So, so what are you really losing? And so when you listen to some of those people, I just think, well, how is this even a thing? How does this even like raised to be enough that you're bothered by it? I think back and I think to when I was a teen and I started menstruating, I was a big tomboy. I didn't like that the menstrual products I bought were all flowery. And I mean, I thought it was just like, so awful. And if there had been menstrual products that had dinosaurs on them, I would have been like, that's cool. I would have felt better carrying it home. I would have felt better having it in my house. And so when you start to think about, well, why does everything have to be so overtly sort of feminine and all attached to those things? Because there's people across the whole spectrum about how they feel about their body, and they might change at different points in their lives, right? And maybe someone's like, well, I just want to buy pads that have dinosaurs on them because, and that's great too. But so I think that, when we sort of get very rigid about, what's feminine, it becomes very performative also, I think, in a lot of ways. And I just don't see how we're actually hurting people with being inclusive. Being mindful that we can still be medically inclusive and still talk about the concept of women's rights. People can do that. You can absolutely do that.
Let's dig into the menstrual cycle.
Okay.
What are the phases within the menstrual cycle? And is that something that you want people to be aware of, or is that too much information?
No, I don't think it's too much information at all. I mean, I think if I don't think that knowing what's happening day to day is necessarily of big practical value. Might be interesting, but I think that it's great for people to understand the basics. And when you understand the basics, you know how things work. I mean, I think everybody would be better off if they knew the basics of how the liver worked and the basics of how the kidney worked. And so the menstrual cycle, you can divide it up into 2 phases, into 4 phases. It doesn't really matter. I mean, the big sort of thing to know is the first part of the cycle is when there is an egg that is developing, an immature egg that is developing estrogen, and that's the follicular phase. And the egg's a follicle. So F for follicular, F for follicle, and F for first, the first part of the cycle. And then you ovulate, and that's when you release the hormone progesterone, and that's the luteal phase. And it's called the luteal phase because you make the corpus luteum left over from ovulation, and that produces the progesterone that we spoke about earlier. So those are the 2 main phases: follicular first, luteal last. Those are the easy ways to remember.
Ovulation in the middle.
Ovulation in the middle. So some people break it down further and call menstruation a phase, but menstruation occurs during the follicular phase. And they break ovulation down as a separate phase. But it's pretty short, and it's really considered the start of the luteal phase. Start
of the menstrual cycle is the follicular phase, and also when the period occurs.
Yeah. So I don't personally think you should break the follicular phase down into menstrual and follicular, because when you're menstruating, that's like the leftover from the previous cycle. But the new cycle is also starting. The way the endometrium gets repaired is from that new estrogen that's being produced. So, it's not it's not a separate phase. There aren't separate hormones being produced that are signaling back and forth to the endometrium during menstruation per se. So, but if you want to think about it that way, you can. You can think about menstruation, follicular, ovulation, or luteal, or you can just say follicular and luteal.
And how many days does ovulation usually last?
So it varies. We used to think that it was, kind of a 12, but it can be anywhere from 10 to 14. And there can be a fair bit of, we used to think that it was far more rigid in the luteal phase, but I think we've learned that there's a little bit more flexibility there. The greater flexibility is in the follicular phase, the first part of the cycle.
And so that ovulation period of 10 to 14 days, that's when someone is most likely to fall pregnant. Does that mean that
you're most likely to get pregnant around, so when ovulation occurs, so when you ovulate, the egg lives for about 24 hours. Mm-hmm. Sperm lives for, I think, anywhere up to 5 days, but I think like by day 5, it's kind of like quasi, but so we say basically 5 days for sperm.
And there's one egg.
egg for 1 day, sperm 5 days. But if you ovulate and then, have sex the next day, it's a possibility. So we basically say there's about a 6-day fertile window, 5 to 6 day fertile window. And that occurs. So you can technically get pregnant before ovulation if the sperm hangs around long enough, right? So if you have sex the day before ovulation, you ovulate, right? So it's the fertile window that we really sort of think about. And implantation occurs, later in the luteal phase.
And you've said the normal menstrual cycle is a tightly regulated hormonal symphony. So just kind of repeat for us, what are the main changes in hormones through these phases that's taking place?
Yeah, so the main ones are at the beginning of the follicular phase, your estrogen levels are very low. And as the few follicles develop, and very quickly there's a lead follicle, and that's producing large amounts of the hormone estradiol. That estradiol is not only thickening the lining of the uterus, but it's signaling the brain and telling the brain what's going on. The brain is also signaling back with the hormone FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. And that is the follicle, the hormone that actually gets the follicle going in the beginning of the cycle. So you have this kind of bidirectional communication. When estrogen levels get high enough, that triggers the surge of a hormone called luteinizing hormone, and that triggers ovulation. Then you have estrogen levels drop with ovulation and progesterone levels rise. But you get a second surge of estrogen, kind of about halfway through the cycle. And then at the end of the cycle, if no pregnancy happens, both progesterone and estrogen drop, and then the whole thing starts again.
And that kind of symphony of hormones, that begins like when someone reaches the age of kind of 10 to 15. And prior to that, what's happening? Yeah,
so prior to that, so it's really fascinating. There are actually 2 cycles going on at the same time. So there's the one we just talked about, but also in the ovaries themselves. It takes about 300 or so days for a follicle to get ready to the point where it can accept stimulation from follicle stimulating hormone so you think about, there's kind of the incredible journey in the ovary of a follicle getting ready. And then there's a group of follicles that are sort of ready. I call those kind of like, they're the ones who have tickets to the club. And then only a few of them get a VIP pass, which is they get stimulated by follicle stimulating hormone. And then very rapidly, a dominant one develops. So you have this.
And develops and
becomes the follicle that's going to ovulate and release the egg. So you have this sort of incredible journey in the ovary that's happening where these dormant follicles are being pulled out and going through some early phases of development to get them ready to be able to accept follicle stimulating hormone. And that's happening all the time. Before puberty, it's going on all the time.
And each follicle can produce one egg?
Yeah, so it's 1-to-1. But each cycle, there might be a group of 10 or 12 follicles that are ready to go. Sometimes they can come in waves. So there can be one wave of follicles, but one egg doesn't become dominant. So then another wave comes and even another wave. That's a possibility.
What happens when someone has twins?
So twins is usually when there are 2 follicles that were dominant and they both ovulated and each one got pregnant. But then you can have identical twins, which is where you have one embryo and it splits. And then you can have this super weird thing called superfecundation, which sounds like a magic spell, doesn't it? And so superfecundation is a super cool thing that happens. Well, I mean, it's very rare. But so when you get pregnant, so the very initial part of conception, the hormone progesterone helps to put a brake on ovulation. So there's not another follicle that develops. It tells your brain to stop the hormone LH. So it's the luteinizing hormone that triggers ovulation. Progesterone stops that, right? Okay. So the progesterone from the corpus luteum, from the early placenta is all like, okay, shut down, because you don't want to get pregnant again while you're pregnant. Because, as I mentioned, those follicles are developing all the time. You don't want those to keeping getting pregnant throughout pregnancy would be like not very useful to the way we've evolved. So, and
they're limited, right? So you kind of want to protect and preserve those.
No, they're going to keep coming every cycle regardless.
The follicle. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought that you were kind of born with a set number
are.
of eggs.
Yeah, you are. And, each cycle, a bunch come out and they either ovulate and you either pregnant or you don't, or if you're pregnant, they come up and they don't really go anywhere. If you're on birth control, they're still developing. If you have an IUD, they're still developing. You also ovulate with an IUD. So these follicles are coming and going and coming and going in that other phase, regardless of what else is going on. So that's still happening. So at the very first part of pregnancy, say you had a few follicles, the first wave develops, you get pregnant. Well, maybe there's another one that kind of squeaked by before progesterone levels are really high, and it's kind of like on its way to being developed. It could have an escape ovulation, and you could get pregnant again a week or so after you got pregnant. So that's the superfecundation. So those aren't technically twins because the conceptions happened on different days. But if you're pregnant with them, as far as you're concerned, they're twins because there's two.
Gotcha. Okay. Let's zoom in a little more on the period. So back to the follicular phase. Mm-hmm. How do you define the period?
So menstruation is the withdrawal of progesterone that triggers the withdrawal of endometrium from the lining of the uterus with the decidua. You're basically getting rid of that decidua we spoke about, that specialized layer. And what happens is the withdrawal of progesterone triggers all kinds of inflammatory chemical cascades. You get release of prostaglandins from the endometrium. That causes the decidua to separate. Blood vessels open up, and the blood helps to push the decidua out. And you get inflammatory fluid as well. So menstrual fluid is a combination of the decidua, inflammatory fluid, and blood. And then by the time you see it on a pad or a tampon, it's maybe got some cervical discharge and some vaginal mucus as well, or vaginal discharge and cervical mucus as well. And so the blood is just blood. It's not special toxin-filled blood. It's not special secret menstrual blood that you're hiding. It's just blood from blood vessels, because just as if you pulled off a scab and you bleed, that's what happens when the endometrium comes off.
And what's the typical volume of blood?
So so we would consider the upper limit of normal of blood to be 80 milliliters, but that would mean fluid would be 160 because it's about half blood. So they do these elegant studies where they can measure the amount of hemoglobin in the fluid. And so that's how they come up with the 80 milliliters, right? But there's also inflammatory fluid, there's decidua, there's discharge. And so what you see that comes out is usually about half blood. So it's about, if you have more than 160 milliliters total over a menstrual cycle, we would begin to be concerned that bleeding was heavy.
And is it true or accurate that you will lose a lot of iron through that bleeding?
Well, you can. It's usually a sign of heavy bleeding. So usually normal menstruation doesn't result in iron deficiency, but it also depends on how much iron you're taking in and your iron stores and your other health for other reasons, right? But people who bleed heavily, yeah, and it's a big problem in the United States. 40% of women ages 22 and under are iron deficient, which is itself a medical condition. So often people are dismissed if they don't have anemia, but iron deficiency is a medical condition. It can cause brain fog. It can affect your immune system. It can cause people to lose hair. It can cause people they have this weird craving for ice when they have iron deficiency, which I don't actually understand the pathophysiology. I learned it once and then
we should look that up.
I know every time I hear it, I'm like, oh, right. That's it. But yeah, so there's a biological explanation. Mm-hmm. It's a biological explanation for everything. It's just.
What about this idea that the color of the blood during a period is like a window into your hormone status?
Yeah, that's some kind of unsubstantiated chiropractic naturopathic thing. No, it's not. So if you have a few drops of blood, things are going to look pink, right? Because if you take food coloring and just put one little drop in a larger volume, it just looks pink. And the more blood you have, the darker it is. And as blood gets oxidized, when it comes out, it gets darker. So, and of course, the degree of inflammatory fluid, maybe that's going to affect the color too. But yeah, and obviously the decidua that comes off, some of it is, what we would call necrotic. It's dead tissue. It's coming out. So, all of those things can affect the color, but it doesn't have any medical significance. So there isn't a a symptom that, if I ask somebody what color their menstrual blood, it doesn't tell me their hormonal status or anything like that.
And how long does a period usually last? And what would be considered normal versus abnormal?
So we consider everything up to 7 days to be normal. So we consider a spot of blood to be normal, anything up to 7 days, although certainly if your bleeding is just a couple of spots, you should talk to your doctor about that just to make sure, because that can sometimes be a sign of an energy imbalance where you're not taking in enough calories. If your period's very light, it might be kind of on its way to stopping. So, it'd be a good thing so I always tell people, if your period is, and if you're on hormonal contraception, it's different. But if your period's normally very, very, very light, it's always a good idea just to check in with your doctor.
You often see that in the kind of 20-year-old female athlete whose training volume is very high and she's under fueling.
Yeah, that's a big problem. So it's relative energy deficiency of sports, or REDS. And they used to call it, I think, the female athletic triad, and now it's REDS. And it's a significant problem, or it can be. If that happens to you when you're 15, 16, these are like peak bone forming years that can increase your risk for osteoporosis because it means you don't have enough estrogen, right? So yeah, it's due to an energy imbalance. You're not taking in enough calories. And so, there's all these fascinating clocks or mechanisms, or however you want to think about it from an analogy standpoint, that are trying to make sure that you're not wasting resources in times of energy deficiency, right? So if you think about, if you don't have enough fuel to sustain menstruation, you don't have enough fuel to sustain pregnancy, because pregnancy, requires extra calories, right?
It's costly.
So, you want the cycle basically to shut down. And so, but it's a sign that somebody is either burning off too much energy, or they're not taking in enough, or both. And so it's important for athletes to take that seriously, because it can lead to, stress fractures and other kinds of problems.
Yeah, it's your body essentially saying, we're just going to focus on helping you survive today.
Right. Well, it's really, when you think about it, if you're a female athlete and your scholarship depends, right, on it, and you think about some sports where incredible leanness and being small or valuable, think about like, I don't know, a long distance runner or a ballet dancer, right? You talk about, where low body fat percentage is incredibly, desired. And so there are these, competing things, but it's problematic if it leads people to affect their health. And so that's why there's been a lot of discussion in the States. Every now and then someone will talk about a form that their daughter was required to fill out to participate in sports. And I understand where people are coming from, because, we have in the United States, we have governments that are, could potentially be tracking your menstrual status and decide to arrest you if they think you had an abortion. So absolutely justified. However, what these are from is making sure that menstruation hasn't stopped. So it's safe for you to participate in sports. Now, the issue should be, it should just be your doctor saying. You shouldn't have to write down your last menstrual period. There should just basically be a box that your doctor ticks. Yes, can participate in sports medically. So I absolutely agree that the detailed information, especially in the United States, I would not want my school district to have that with our current political situation. But that still doesn't change the fact that it is important for teen athletes especially to make sure that their athletic pursuits aren't having an impact on their energy status.
Yeah, speaking of tracking the period, are there any kind of big studies that have looked at what's normal in terms of kind of variability with regards to the onset of the period, how long it lasts, how heavy it is? Just anecdotally, women in my life, often are saying, oh, my period's late this month, or it's early, or I'm having a heavy period. What is normal in terms of the period kind of varying from month to month, and what is not normal?
Yeah, so we have some pretty good data here. So the menstrual cycle can be anywhere from, it sort of depends on the definition that you use. The WHO has kind of one definition and another group has another, but the most common one is a length anywhere between 24 to 38 days. But some people use 21 to 35. So we'll go with 24 to 38. So every 24 to 38 days, and the length of the bleeding up to 7 days is considered normal. And there can be a 7-day swing for start of the cycle. So 1 month could be 20, or one cycle could be 26 days. The next cycle could be 30. The next cycle could be 28. And all of that would be normal. This idea that the menstrual cycle is this like clock that happens every 28 days is not, not based in factual information. And in general, the average, which doesn't really apply because that's like saying, the average height is whatever, 5'6". Well, yeah, but that doesn't mean there's something wrong with you if you're 5'2" or 6 feet tall, right? That's just an average. So the average is, I think it's 29.2 days or 29 point, a little bit. And so, so that's the average, but the range is 24 to 38.
I think I remember reading something, Nurses' Health Study 2, certainly, I think someone shared it with me, that found an association between the length of someone's period and lifespan, and seemed to suggest that longer period, was associated with reduced lifespan, increased mortality.
So I'm not 100% sure about that. So there definitely are studies that show a shorter menstrual cycle is associated with an earlier menopause. And an earlier menopause is, especially if you're talking about age 43, 44, is associated with a higher risk of cardiovascular disease and things like that. I don't know how well some of these other studies controlled for polycystic ovarian syndrome, which typically people would have very long cycles, right? And they have a higher risk of type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome and heart disease and even a higher risk of suicide. So there's a higher risk. So I'm not sure if that longer cycle thing, I don't know if those studies have appropriately accounted for the fact that medical conditions could be causing that. Also, you may only be having a period every 6 months because you're not taking in enough food, right? So, so there could, so I
some
think
confounding factors.
Yeah. So I think if you take out like all the medical reasons, I don't believe that a menstrual cycle of say 35 days is more likely to be associated with a problem than one of 29 days.
Okay. So there's no real data to say it's inherently a problem.
Yeah. I mean, if there is, I didn't find it.
Sure. I think last time we spoke, we briefly spoke about COVID vaccines. Now we've got probably couple more years of data, or at least a year of extra data. Is there any data looking at how the COVID vaccines affected the menstrual cycle and or fertility?
So no effect on fertility. In fact, if you want to optimize your fertility, get vaccinated because you're less likely to have a stillbirth and pregnancy. You're less likely to have a terrible pregnancy outcome. So
the COVID vaccine?
Yeah, because getting COVID is really bad for you when you're pregnant. So absolutely. So if you want to optimize your chance of having a successful pregnancy, you want to be vaccinated. There's no question about that, because dying from COVID during pregnancy is really bad for your fertility outcome. And it's increased risk of stillbirths with catching COVID during pregnancy. So, so vaccination, great for fertility. There's actually been several IVF studies that have shown there's no change in fertilization or anything like that. There's no miscarriage rate associated with it. So if people take one thing away from this, I would like them to take away that they do not have to worry about their fertility with the COVID vaccine. So from an effect on the menstrual cycle, we do have some data. And it's really interesting, you heard about it all the time on social media and then nobody talks about it. And so it's always important to have data, because what we see curated on social media might not actually be reflective of what happens in the general population. So the best that we can tell is that there's about a 1 day or less lengthening in the menstrual cycle with COVID-19 vaccination. And I've already said that up to 7-day swing is normal. So a 1-day swing is well within that 7-day range and unlikely to be, medically significant at all. However, if you then separate out the groups and look at people who got 2 vaccines during a menstrual cycle. So if right at the beginning, right, you were getting a dose 3 weeks apart. So if you got your first dose early, you got your second dose 3 weeks later, you got 2 doses in your cycle. Those are the people who are far more likely to have a lengthening in their cycle, and they actually drive most of the change when you look at the entire population. So, and for those people, I think it's like, I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but maybe it's like 10%, it's just a ballpark guess, I can't remember specifically, had a lengthening of their cycle of more than 7 days. So something that would be like medically significant, you'd notice. And the prevailing belief is it's probably related to immune system activation super early when that initial follicle is developing. Because remember, the whole system's designed to try to optimize outcomes. If there's a big inflammatory sort of storm, if you will, your body's basically, and again, this is an analogy, whoa, maybe this isn't the optimal time to get pregnant. Let's just, okay, good, we're fine. That kind of thing. So there can be a delay, but the good news is by your next cycle, you're right back to what you were. So you might have a lengthening of your menstrual cycle, and this is primarily due to a lengthening of the follicular phase, and then you're back to normal. And there's about a 7% risk of having a heavier period that cycle.
Wouldn't COVID itself also be activating the immune system? Like
Absolutely.
if you get the infection, where I'm getting at with this is there any data looking at how COVID affects the menstrual cycle in people that are unvaccinated versus vaccinated?
No, not that I'm aware of. Because people don't often track when they're sick, when you have so I don't think that that's been done in a large study that I've seen. It's possible it was published and I missed it. But we do know that absolutely getting COVID can absolutely affect your menstrual cycle. And depending how sick you get, it could have more of an impact. Certainly if you end up in the ICU and you end up very ill, then you're going to have much more of an impact from that. And so, yes, the best way to keep your menstrual cycle healthy is to always be less sick.
Is it normal for women or people who menstruate that spend time with one another for their cycles to sync up?
No, it's a myth. Everybody gets really upset about it. Seriously, I'm like, who do you think's sponsoring me? Like big non-period syncing? Yeah, it's a myth.
So where does that come from? And if someone's like, well, hang on, actually, my girlfriends and I, we all have our period at the same time. Like, what's happening?
Yes.
There?
So there's great explanations for it. It's just a really fascinating social or cultural phenomenon. So I don't actually know the history, meaning did people believe it in the 1600s or did people believe in the 1800s? I don't really know. But you have to also know that they didn't know about hormones and they didn't know about things. So they were just very concerned about making sure people menstruated because they thought it was a buildup of toxins. So I don't think they were like really specifically thinking about that. Maybe they weren't, I don't know. But in the early 80s, there was a study that suggested that menstrual syncing or menstrual synchronicity, that sounds like a album, doesn't it? Like, what's my new album? It's Menstrual Synchronicity. It's dropping soon. Call me, Taylor. So there was a study that suggested it. Now, if you go back and look at the study that has some flaws with it and isn't, probably wouldn't have been accepted today the way it was in the early 80s. That's also pretty common from a lot of studies, right? We learn more, we, have different methods. We couldn't do hormone tests and things in the early 80s the way we can do them today. So there's a lot of things that change. It's been looked at by several different researchers since in larger studies with, better design, and it hasn't shown. And there's no biological reason it could happen. So the people who propose it never propose a biologically plausible hypothesis. So people go, what about pheromones? Well, so no one has actually ever proven the existence of human pheromones yet. I know the perfume industry would like everybody to think otherwise, but it's never been proven. And
Jen Gunter busting myths left, right, and center.
I'm so mean. This is what makes people think I'm mean.
How dare you?
I know, how dare I? And it's because we don't have a functioning vomeronasal organ. So, and that's what dogs and cats and animals that can detect pheromones have. And so ours doesn't work. So what's traveling through the ether from me to somebody else? And if you think about it on a different level, I find it really distasteful because it kind of makes women sound like they're seasonal breeders, right? That there's this alpha female that can drag all these other like lesser females into her menstrual orbit. I don't know. So when you hear these myths, very few people kind of follow them through to their logical conclusion. So what does that really, like if we keep going on that line of thinking, what's that telling me? And almost always when you go along that line of thinking, it starts to sound like worse and worse and worse for how you're talking about women.
Sometimes it can sound like a nice story. For example, like in this example, I've heard people say, well, the ancestral or evolutionary explanation is that perhaps there was survival benefit if women were going through their pregnancy at the same time and giving birth to babies at the same time.
Well, so we would know it though, because that wouldn't have been a trait that we would have lost. So we would be seeing people coming in, all the pregnancies happening at the same time, and then for 2 or 3 weeks in labor and delivery, like we would see that. So that's not something that happens. And there's no biological basis for it. I mean, your own body controls your cycle. You have agency. I don't mean that you think it to happen, but your body is your own agency. It's not somebody else isn't controlling you. We don't ever say that about men. We don't ever say that like, wow, testosterone is such a powerful hormone. It can drag all men into having erections, right?
Slightly related, yet unrelated. It gets me thinking about, is it accurate, or is there any truth to the idea that when a woman is on oral contraception, on the pill, her taste in men is different than if she was not taking the pill?
No.
Have you heard that?
Yeah, I've heard it. The research is not very solid. There are other people who have disproven it. And, none of these studies control for reasons that people get divorced, right? So people might stop the pill because they're not planning on having sex with the guy that they dislike and are wanting to get divorced from, right? So stopping the pill had nothing to do with, oh, wow, I'm with the wrong man. It was a planned decision, because why would I take contraception for someone I'm not having sex with? So there isn't any good data to support that. And I think that people need to be very, very careful making grand proclamations based on not solid data at all. There's no evidence to support it. And of course, all my friends, I have a couple of friends who've never taken any hormonal contraception. They're like, well, how do I explain my 3 divorces? And so also that kind of positions men as not having responsibility in a relationship falling apart, right? It's all about you and your hormones. Really? So yeah, the grander the claim, the more extravagant the claim, the grander the evidence needs to be, and it doesn't exist. It seems to serve a very specific narrative of keeping people away from using medication that can be very useful for them. So there's one other thing I'd like people to think about when they believe that they've had menstrual sinking, is that think about a time when you've been driving and your windshield wipers are going and it's raining, and the car in front of you windshield wipers are going. And there's times where your wipers are matching up exactly with them. And then there's times where they don't, and then they match up again, and then they don't. And that's what's happening when you notice somebody's cycle being the same as yours. You're only remembering the time where they are matching up because of random things. This is a random change. So if you have 2 events that are occurring randomly, they will match up at times, and then they won't, and then they will, and then they won't. But because of recall bias, you just remember the times that they were.
But Jen, I want to believe that when I look at my phone, magically, it's always 11:11.
I know humans. We are weird creatures, and we like to hold on to little beliefs. And again, I just think that I just believe it's important to have the facts, because while we can say, well, what's the problem with having a menstrual sinking myth? Okay, well, there isn't really a problem, except, well, what if it makes one person feel like they're always submissive to the group? What if one person's made to feel like they're always following? Do you think that might maybe affect them a little bit? Well, that's a possibility. And these myths, and this is also an issue, are weaponized by the wellness movement, by people trying to tell you that, oh, well, you shouldn't be on hormonal contraception because you're going to miss all these important rhythms that we learn because of cycle syncing. So it becomes part of this narrative that's very easily warped or used in another way. So I just think that's why it's important to know. So if you want to believe something that's not true about your body, okay, that's totally fine. But just remember that these things are often misused by people who have ill intentions.
allow me to introduce you to Momentous, my go-to supplement brand for all things protein and creatine. It's pretty easy, especially if you're not tracking everything that you eat, to fall short of the optimal daily protein intake. To help reach my daily protein target, I complement my diet with 1.5 scoops of Momentous's chocolate or vanilla chai plant-based protein for 30 grams of protein and all essential amino acids, which supports muscle growth, hormone and collagen production, skin health, and recovery. I also consume 10 grams of Momentous's creatine daily to enhance energy production, muscle strength, bone health, and cognition, with studies now showing the benefit of creatine on short-term memory and intelligence. I'll do anything for a little extra brain power. And what's really cool is that both products are NSF certified. This certification is the only third-party certification program trusted by the likes of the NBA, the MLB, Ironman, etc. With this, you can be confident that Momentous's protein and creatine are free from unsafe levels of contaminants, prohibited substances, or masking agents, and that what is on the label actually matches what is in the product. For discounts on these supplements, visit livemomentous.com and use code LIVINGPROOF for up to 36% off on subscriptions or 20% off one-time purchases. That's livemomentous.com with code LIVINGPROOF at checkout.
Okay, let's come back to aggravation, pain, and suffering. What are the common symptoms that a woman may experience through the menstrual cycle, and when in the menstrual cycle are those symptoms typically experienced?
Yeah, so there's a wide range of symptoms. There's people who go through their menstrual cycle without really noticing anything. They really don't have much pain with menstruation. They don't have really any emotional symptoms that might change it. They go on pretty fine. And then,
Is that the minority of people?
I think that, to be completely asymptomatic, yes, but definitely there are. So I think it's just, it's funny because when I was on book tour, I had a couple people stand up and say, am I like weird for not having any symptoms? So I've now included that in all of my discussion to kind of go through the range because I want people to appreciate there's a range. Then for most people, the follicular phase, the first part of the cycle, tends to be pretty stable from a symptom standpoint. We'll talk about menstruation at the end. With ovulation, there can be pain for some people. Some people can have ovulatory pain. And we actually believe that's due to muscle spasm in the ovary. People used to think it was due to like the egg bursting out, but it doesn't burst out. It's not under pressure. It's kind of like the sac dissolves and it just kind of comes out. So we believe it's actually due to muscle spasm. And that's called Mittelschmerz, which is, I think, German for middle pain. I was really saddened to find out there wasn't a Dr. Mittelschmerz. I thought there would have been, but no, it's not from that.
That's during ovulation.
Yeah, that's just, so it's ovulatory pain. Yeah, it actually happens right before ovulation.
Right. I'm clearly very ignorant here because I had always assumed that the pain was experienced during the bleeding.
Well, we're going to get to that. That's another pain. So that's dysmenorrhea. That's painful periods. So I'm kind of working through. So with ovulation or right before ovulation, you can get pain, and that's Mittelschmerz, and that is from muscle spasm, and that's due to release of prostaglandins with ovulation. Then another symptom people can have in the luteal phase due to the progesterone is PMS types of symptoms. So that could be bloating, it could be mood swings, it could be headache, it could be food cravings, a wide variety of things, sleep disturbance. And then with menstruation, there are a couple of things that can happen. So people can get menstrual migraines. That's actually due to the withdrawal of estrogen. So when those estrogen levels drop that second time, that can actually trigger migraines for some people. So that, menstrual migraines, everybody doesn't get them, but certainly some people do.
So why would that trigger migraines in one person, but then not the next? $1 million question.
Complex genetics and environment, multifactorial. How about that?
Well, that's a gap that you just left ajar. And I have a supplement, $79 that you can buy for that.
You do. $79.99 is, it's called Menstrual Max. Anyway, and then we get to menstrual pain. So menstrual pain is due to the withdrawal of the withdrawal of progesterone, which releases prostaglandins. Prostaglandins are the things like if you cut yourself, you release prostaglandins, that's what hurts. So the prostaglandins, and you get release of nitrous oxide and all these other like inflammatory chemicals. So you get the pain. So prostaglandins themselves can amp up pain. They are sort of what we call analgesic substances. But then you get significant a decrease in blood flow to the uterine muscle. You can get severe cramping. And if you think about it, if you've had a really bad Charlie horse in your calf, right? A bad muscle cramp can really hurt. So think about you getting this really intense pressure and this intense squeezing. That is to push the blood out. It's also to compress the blood vessels to stop the bleeding, right? So it's an important part of the process. And it's a pretty significant pressure that's generated. It can be as much as 120 millimeters of mercury. It's really a lot of pressure. So it can be really, really painful. And obviously there's some people who are more sensitive to prostaglandins than others. And there's genetic probably differences in receptors and other things that can make people have more pain or less pain. And then there's also menstrual diarrhea, which can be due to the prostaglandins. And about 12% of people can get that. There's a whole bunch of things.
You wrote about, I think in your book, you said that was something you personally experienced.
Yeah. I always say I had terrible menstrual diarrhea, but anyways, it had to be like, well, it doesn't need the qualifier terrible. It's pretty bad. Yeah. So it was and I'd never heard, none of my friends talked about it.
Does it swing the other way as well to constipation?
Some people can get constipation. I mean, the body's weird. It hasn't read the manual. It doesn't care about the manual, And I think, probably in 50 years, we're going to find out, or maybe not 50, that's just a guess. We're going to be able to say, oh, well, your receptor A alpha for this is, you're homozygous for this mutation, or you've got this enzyme. And we're going to find out all these reasons. Like, for example, about 10% of people who take drugs like ibuprofen or naproxen for painful periods, drugs that block prostaglandins, they don't do anything for them, but they should because they block prostaglandins. And I'm not talking about people who have other reasons, like maybe endometriosis or another condition, but it seems like some people are resistant to those medications. We don't know why. Maybe in 10 years' time, we're going to find out there's an enzyme.
Ibuprofen. I think you wrote a blog about, was it on TikTok? Was there a trend on TikTok where people were suggesting you can take ibuprofen or Jello to stop your period?
Yeah, you can take.
Is that a good idea?
Take a high dose of ibuprofen and Jello. Where does this come from?
As in taking them together?
I guess like a shot. I don't know. Like you mix the Jello up and drink it like the water. And it's like, how do people really? Anyway, so no. So
why would you want to do that? Because someone's experiencing pain?
Mostly because maybe you're going away for the weekend, you don't have your period. You can take hormones for that. So you don't have to, there's other ways to do it. But it won't stop your period. What it can do is it can reduce your flow. So if you take an appropriate dose of ibuprofen or naproxen, and especially if you can start the day before your period, you can reduce your flow on average by 20 to 30%.
Do you want to be doing that? Like, is there any downsides to reducing the flow? No.
It's good. Yeah. Less blood loss is good. So there's not like an amount of blood that has to come out. The bleeding stops when the bleeding stops.
It doesn't affect that turnover that you were talking about earlier.
I tell people, it's not a great analogy, but think about a bleeding nose. The bleeding nose stops when the bleeding nose stops. It's not like there's more blood that needs to come out. You've stopped the inflammation, the injury that's allowing the blood to come out. So lots of people want to have less bleeding. Menstrual pads are expensive. It's a hassle to change menstrual cups, all these things. So periods are optional. You don't have to have them at all if you don't want to. So it's a good tool. It doesn't work for everybody. But a lot of people, there are people who don't want to take hormones and they say, well, wow, if I can take something just for 3 or 4 days a month and that makes my period lighter, great.
Periods are optional. We're going to come back to that. I want to double back here. Menstrual diarrhea, I just realized. So is there anything that someone can do for that? Because that sounds like something that could be embarrassing. It could just affect someone's ability to kind of navigate their day-to-day.
Yeah. I once was in New York and spent the whole day, we were at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I spent the whole day in the bathroom. Every time I'd leave, I have to go back.
That's not fun.
It was not fun. I was 20. I was really sucked. I was in New York and I basically had to go from store to store to use bathrooms. It was awful. So anybody out there suffering with it, I'm very empathetic. So ibuprofen, medications like that. But I didn't know that at the time because I thought there was just something wrong with me.
Right. All of this is kind of more of the physical manifestation or physical symptoms. What about emotional symptoms or changes in one's kind of psychological state through the menstrual cycle?
Well, we have to be very careful how we talk about that because, we don't ever want to position somebody as being lesser because of their menstrual cycle or less competent or anything like that. But definitely during the luteal phase, with the release of the hormone progesterone, some people can have PMS symptoms. So there's a big spectrum. A lot of people might have some bloating, feel like they're retaining some fluid. Many people might notice food cravings. Some people, again, sleep disturbance, other types of things. And for some people, it can be a massive trigger for depression, that they can have really significant depressive issues, in the week or so before their period. And so PMS and premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is essentially thought of as a more severe version.
What is PMS?
Premenstrual syndrome. So you can have premenstrual symptoms, which are, not enough to really they're there, but they're not particularly bothersome. You just kind of notice them. Then there's PMS, which is kind of more of a constellation, and maybe there's more impact on your activities of daily living. And
is that a diagnosis?
Yeah. So we think, if you look at kind of menstrual symptoms, maybe 70 to 80% of people get some type of symptom, like bloating, food cravings, that type of thing. Then maybe 20% have PMS, and maybe 2% have premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is the more severe version. And the thing that is the hallmark is that these symptoms can't start before ovulation because they're related to progesterone. So triggers ovulation or sometime after and ends with the end of the menstrual cycle, with menstruation. So by the time the period is over, those symptoms need to be gone. People need to feel that they're completely symptom-free from these symptoms during their follicular phase.
What are the best things that someone can do or explore if they're experiencing a considerable amount of pain, be it during the period phase or ovulation?
Well, so we would treat ovulation pain and period pain different because they're different things. Most people with ovulation pain, they'll be managed fine with taking some non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medications, and knowing when to time it can be helpful. If it's very bothersome for a small percentage of people, you can take medications to stop ovulation, like hormonal contraception. So that could be an option. For pain during menstruation, so that's a whole gamut of things. So we need to know if we think this is run-of-the-mill period pain, meaning it's just the pain people get with periods. And I don't mean the word just to downplay its significance, but just to imply that that's the only cause, versus period pain that could be related to a condition like endometriosis or adenomyosis or maybe large fibroids. So we consider the first one primary dysmenorrhea, meaning it's just bad luck of the draw, maybe something to do with your enzymes, maybe something to do with how much prostaglandins you produce, who knows, but bad periods. The other is secondary dysmenorrhea, painful periods due to something else. And we're much more suspicious of it being due to something else if your periods have always been painful from the very get-go. So if when you were 12, you got your period and they were awful from the beginning, we'd be more concerned about that. Because when you first start menstruating, you don't ovulate regularly at all. In fact, your first year or so, you may only ovulate once or twice. It's much less common. But you need ovulation to have primary dysmenorrhea because you have to have withdrawal of progesterone. That's the sentinel event. So that's why when people have primary dysmenorrhea, usually their periods aren't too bad. It might be heavy, they might be irregular, but they don't start becoming painful for several years. Versus people with secondary dysmenorrhea, now it's not always the case, but if I'm seeing a 19-year-old who tells me that her periods have been cripplingly painful since she was 13, I'm much more worried that there could be something else causing that.
Right. So you want to rule out fibroids, PCOS, those things.
Well, PCOS doesn't typically cause pain, so it's more endometriosis. And so, so there are a couple of different ways to approach it. And this is really an individual thing that's always hard to sum up because what you decide really depends on the person sitting in front of you and also what they want to do. So you can start with medications to stop ovulation and to reduce prostaglandins. So you could give non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medications. That would just stop or reduce prostaglandins. You could give hormonal contraception. If you gave the hormonal birth control pill or you gave the Depo-Provera shot, you'd actually stop ovulation. But if you give any of the hormonal contraception with progestins, like the implant, any birth control pill, or the Mirena IUD, the levonorgestrel IUD, you thin out that lining of the uterus. So if there's no lining, you don't produce prostaglandins. So you can control that. You can even give people hormones in such a way they never get a period. So that's one treatment option. Another option would be to look for evidence of endometriosis, maybe with an ultrasound, maybe with an MRI. Whether you need to do that might depend on what you find on exam. It might depend on other factors. And then you can also do surgery to look for endometriosis and then remove it if you see it. And so there's kind of this whole, spectrum. Now, we often hear awful stories of how women suffered for 20 years before they were taken seriously. So that spectrum that I gave you shouldn't really take longer than 9 months to work through, right? So there isn't a sort of a way, if medical algorithms are being followed, that this should take longer than a year. Now, I don't want a year can be a long time, but someone might say, well, I want to try the birth control pill. Okay, that might take you 3 months, 3 to 4 months. How well is that working? Well, it's working a little bit. It's nothing. Maybe I want to try the IUD instead. Then maybe I'm getting an MRI. And then maybe, okay, now I'm like 5 months in. It's not really helping. The MRI doesn't show endometriosis. It doesn't pick it up all the time, but it can be helpful. I want to go ahead and have surgery. Or you could be someone who says, wow, the pill's really helped. I don't want to have surgery.
Just to be clear, the pill is stopping ovulation, but the woman still has her period?
Well, so when you're on the birth control pill, you are stopping that sort of hormonal symphony that is causing the egg to develop and the lining to get thick. And you're replacing that with levels that are stable every single day. And what that does is, because so that stops ovulation, or most of the time it stops it. Because the progestin in it, that's the second hormone, it's progesterone-like, is so strong on the lining of the uterus. It was designed to be that way. It's very progestogenic to the lining of the uterus. It flattens the lining out so nothing really develops. And so you get very little lining. So if you stop the birth control pill for 7 days, you have withdrawn the hormone progestin. So just like withdrawing progesterone, you'll get some bleeding. But for some people, the lining is so thin because you had those hormones the whole time, you don't get any. And that's okay. And some people decide not to go off for 7 days or for 3 days.
And that's okay too.
It's totally okay. You can just go straight through and not get a period at all. So some people who have terrible menstrual pain do that and they're like, no period, no pain. I'm great.
Okay, so help me understand something here. I just had an episode on testosterone and TRT for men. Mm-hmm. And it's fairly well documented that if you have exogenous testosterone, that a male's kind of own physiology or machinery that makes testosterone kind of turns off. And when you remove exogenous testosterone, it doesn't always just turn back on itself as it kind of naturally would. Sometimes people need different compounds that kind of activate or target the pituitary gland, for example, right. And then you end up kickstarting this system again. And so if someone's hearing that oral hormones can kind of stop ovulation and thinking, does that kind of weaken my system, my physiology, such that when I come off of these hormones, it has forgotten how to have this increase in estrogen, right. This increase in progesterone. It has forgotten how to ovulate.
No, I can see how people be concerned about that, but the birth control pill mimics what happens when you're pregnant. So the system is designed to be shut down and stop ovulating while you're pregnant. And this is due to, and you get elevated levels of estrogen and due to elevated levels of progesterone. So it's really mimicking that. In fact, the knowledge that progesterone stopped ovulation during pregnancy was the key thing that led to the development of hormonal contraception. So what's happening when you're on the pill? Remember how I said there's those 2 cycles. There's that first incredible journey that we don't really know too much about, that after 300 days, there's a group of follicles that are ready to show up at, cross the VIP line. Birth control pill doesn't affect those at all. Those are still happening all the time, okay? You still get a group of follicles that present themselves to be ready, but they just don't get that trigger from FSH to develop. So they just hang out, and they dissolve. And then the next cycle, they come out, they hang out, and they dissolve. That's why when people miss 2 or 3 pills, they get pregnant, or their risk at getting pregnant. Because if you miss a few pills, they're waiting there in the wings. Oh, hormones gone. Boo. I'm going to try to ovulate. I mean, they're not thinking, but you know what I mean.
So when you're pregnant, I think you said this earlier, but when you're pregnant, FSH levels are blunted.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and you said when you're on the pill, it's like being pregnant. And I can imagine people hear that and think, okay, that makes sense. But you're pregnant for 9 months, and then the body goes back to this state where the menstrual cycle kind of continues again, versus someone who is on the pill perhaps for 10 years straight.
Well, if you were pregnant and breastfeeding 10 times in your lifetime, that would be pretty much the same, right?
So what I'm hearing is that when you come off the pill, the body resumes its production of FSH. Is that what
Everything
happens?
goes back to exactly how it was. There is no post-pill infertility. There's no post-pill change in cycle.
Is that a myth? Like, am I touching on something that a lot of people believe?
Yeah, and a lot of naturopaths and chiropractors use this to, tell people that, their body is broken. So the common scenario is many people go on the pill because they have problems. Maybe you have super heavy periods when you're 16 or 17 and you're bleeding all over the place. So we start the birth control pill because you're iron deficient and your periods are heavy and they're causing pain, and you're on the pill and you're great. And then maybe 15 years later, you stop the pill. Well, now your periods are irregular. Well, during the time you were on the pill, maybe you really actually had polycystic ovarian syndrome, and now you've stopped the treatment for polycystic ovarian syndrome, because actually the estrogen-containing birth control pill is fantastic treatment for polycystic ovarian syndrome. Now you've stopped the treatment, so of course you have the symptoms and they emerge. So this is all part of a big campaign by people who are selling services that are dependent on you not being on hormones for profit. So I can't sell you a period repair supplement if your periods are fine on the birth control pill. I can't sell you an ovarian detox. I can't sell you a birth control pill, a detox. I can't sell you my period coaching services if you're on the pill. I can't do hormone tests on you if you're on the pill and charge for those and see you back in the office. So there's this big sort of, period taking advantage of industry that, is really taking advantage of people.
So let's just say we're someone who is in that kind of taking advantage of people position. Let's think about what their experience is. So I'm imagining there's a selection bias in terms of the people that they're seeing that are coming to them. These are probably a group of people who have taken the pill for many years, come off, and are having some type of symptoms or can't get pregnant. What I'm kind of hearing from you, or what I'm led to believe, would it be accurate to say that a lot of these people who are experiencing problems after coming off the pill had some type of underlying issue prior to going on the pill that was never understood, managed, treated, and thus when they come off the pill, it's just kind of surfacing again?
I think it's kind of hard to be so broad as that, because you're looking at there's so many different groups. So you might be looking at someone who started the pill when they were 15. You might be looking at someone who started it postpartum. You might be looking at someone who started it because they had menstrual migraines. You might be looking at someone who started it because they had birth control. And then there can be all different kinds of symptoms. And so knowing which symptom could be something that could be pill related or not pill related, it's hard to know. I think there's a common theme that a lot of these people have probably been dismissed by the healthcare system. They've had some kind of symptom. And whether those symptoms are related to contraception or they're not related to contraception, whether they had fear because of what they read online. So I think it's such a big category. I don't think I can generalize. But what I can say is that the pill doesn't cause hormonal conditions. We know this. The birth control pill doesn't affect future fertility. We know this. The birth control pill doesn't mimic menopause. We know this. And
But
so,
yet you still hear, at least, and I know it's on social media, I'm just thinking about what people are exposed to,
Yeah.
story after story after story, where someone says, I was on birth control, I came off, my hormones are all over the place.
well, it's always hard to know what to do with that because I don't know what kind of testing the person had and if anything was done was valid. So it's not a possible scenario. What I can say is that there's all kinds of people on social media saying that vaccines gave their kids autism, right? We know that's not a possibility. Now, that's something that's been super well studied, and that's a one specific thing. So there are, we know that a very small percentage of people may develop depression on the pill. It's a small percentage, maybe 1 in 200. So this is something that is more common among teens. These are also probably the same people who are at higher risk for postpartum depression. So it's probably not a pill-related phenomenon, more of a hormonal-related phenomenon. The pill is just one type of hormone. And people are on medications and they don't feel good on them. I mean, I have people that take all kinds of medications that don't feel good on them. Okay, then you stop it. You have to look at what's the net benefit for you, right? So for example, I might have somebody on the medication doxycycline for acne. If they don't feel good on it, they want to stop it. Okay. But nobody's on TikTok making videos about how that's like that medication has damaged their hormones. You know what I mean? So I think that you also have, again, this data void. You have a data void. You have people who have probably not been taken seriously in the medical when they've been in the office. And then you have people taking advantage of that by, selling tests that are not indicated or, telling people things about their hormones that don't make any sense at all. And to take all of that kind of noise and distill it down into something that's super easy to understand is just not possible.
I want to play a clip for you.
I have recently been on a deep dive with my own hormones, and I actually brought in my own Dutch test results for Dr. Mindy to look at and advise on. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me. I can't wait to dive into your Dutch.
And now I'm the biggest fan of this test.
Yes. I was like, oh my gosh, I think we could end breast cancer if every woman ran a Dutch test every single year. I literally just think it's that great of a test. What it does is the first 3 categories it gives you are the major categories of your hormones. So estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. The first thing I did when I picked up this Dutch test is look at the age and go, okay, you can see that your estradiol, your progesterone they actually look like mine, and I'm 53.
And is this because I was on birth control for such a long time?
Birth control really messes up the whole hormonal system.
So there's a bit there for us to kind of unpack. There's two claims. One, that if every woman knew this, we could probably end breast cancer if every woman did the Dutch test. And secondly, that the pill kind of disrupts hormone status.
I would say that's a stunning display of ignorance. And that person's a chiropractor, so not somebody who, we would consider to be an expert in hormones. There is no data that I'm aware of that says taking a Dutch test would reduce the risk of breast cancer. And I think to say otherwise is really preying on the fears of breast cancer. I think those kinds of statements are actually really disgusting for people to say that. There are all kinds of super smart people in oncology studying how to reduce the rates of breast cancer. And we have definitely lots of strategies. For example, reducing alcohol intake we know is very important. We also know that people that are at high risk, which we do by calculating, not with a Dutch test, we do with models like the Gale model. There's other models where we calculate breast cancer risk based on family history and breast density and genetics and all kinds of factors. And based on that, there are some people who we actually recommend that we give them hormones to block estrogen, to protect their breast tissue. Obviously, we know there's genetic risk factors and there's genetic tests to do, again, depending on family history and other kinds of things. So these are the evidence-based approaches. The Dutch test is not in that. And again, this is one of those things that how do you counteract something that is completely not a thing? You can't change your estrogen metabolism with what you eat or fasting or things like that. If we do know that there are certain dietary patterns that are associated with a lower risk of breast cancer, and that's a high fiber diet, there's always the same dietary patterns, right? The same ones associated with the lowest risk of breast cancer, the ones associated with the lowest risk of colon cancer, the lowest risk of heart disease.
It's like a Mediterranean diet.
High fiber, more plant-based proteins, yes, lower saturated
fatty
fat.
fish instead of red meat.
Exactly. And the key here, fiber. So what a high fiber content does specifically for breast cancer, besides all the other probably anti-inflammatory things, is you get rid of some of the estrogen through your bile into your bowel. And some of it can be metabolized by bowel bacteria and can get reabsorbed, raising your estrogen levels, basically giving you extra estrogen. If you have a high fiber diet, basically that's less likely to happen. Your microbiome is different. And so your microbiome doesn't allow as much of that intrahepatic reabsorption.
That's interesting because there is a whole movement. I'm not sure if you're aware of it. It's called the pro-metabolic diet, which is like this ancestral, it seems to be kind of championed by a lot of women who take the position that we should eat an ancestrally consistent diet that's high in saturated fat, high in red meat and eggs, and very low in plant foods and fiber, and that this is best for hormone balance and fertility and skin and staying youthful, all these things.
Well, I would say those people don't really know what an ancestral diet is, because people weren't eating primarily beef and pork, and they were eating whatever they could scavenge and get, right? Which would have been a lot of roots and berries and plants. And then they would have been punctuated with, episodes where there's a larger kill and more people eat, so this whole romanticizing of like an ancestral or Neanderthal diet, or however you want to phrase it, is just ludicrous and not supported in science at all. So the best diet is, a high fiber diet with good quality proteins. Also, do those people want to have ancestral dental care too? Right. Do they want to have ancestral travel? Or is it just, you should be walking everywhere then if you need to be ancestral, right? So it's this sort of romanticization, exotization of things. It's just medically nonsensical. So no, the healthiest diet for your body, the healthiest diet for your heart is the healthiest diet for your body in general. So if your heart's happy, everything's happy. And the same with hormones, again, a high fiber diet, more than 25 grams of fiber is what we want people to aim for, because that gives you a low risk of breast cancer. So there is no scenario where we would recommend doing a Dutch test to help you understand your breast cancer risk. It is true that the way estrogen is metabolized, the same way many things are metabolized, that there can be toxic metabolites in the step, right? So there is lots of different research that's looking at all those kinds of things, but these are not things that we translate to doing a Dutch test. So there's no indication to do that to reduce your breast cancer risk. And then what was the other one?
The second claim was about oral contraception, the pill, negatively affecting kind of hormone balance.
Well, I can understand how a chiropractor wouldn't know about medications because they don't learn about them in chiropractic school and they're not allowed to prescribe them.
Is that all we need to say there?
I really think that's all we need to say. There is no long-term consequences on your hormones from taking the birth control pill. When we talked about it, how the system pops back on. If there were, you would have those same long-term consequences from being pregnant. We don't see that. Infertility specialists put people on the pill to time infertility cycles. If it affected your hormones, they wouldn't do that, right? It's out of your system in 7 days. That's not how it works. That represents a gross misunderstanding of the product. And again, if you don't learn that in school and you don't prescribe it, how could you be an expert in it?
What about the potential risks of the pill with regards to osteoporosis and various types of cancer? I know that this gets brought up quite a bit as well.
So for people who are taking the pill who do not have REDS, there is no concern that we know about from an osteoporosis standpoint. There have been a couple of papers suggesting that maybe starting it at age 12 or 13 could be a risk factor for some people. Is it possible that might affect bone development? I don't think that there is good data there. The whole theory is based on ethinyl estradiol in the pill may have some inflammatory effects. And could that affect bone development? I think it stimulates IGF, one of the growth factors. I can't remember which one. However, for somebody, we do not believe though that that's a major concern at all. And so if you are taking the pill for contraception, if you're taking the pill for these reasons, then that's not a concern. If you have relative energy deficiency of sports, or if you have primary ovarian insufficiency, then we do believe that it is better for you to use transdermal estradiol to protect your bones than to use the birth control pill to protect your bones. But this is a different situation. We're not talking about somebody who's got hormones that are working normally. Because remember, when you're on the pill, you're still getting those eggs, they're recruiting, you're still making some estrogen, you're making some of your own estradiol. When you have relative energy deficiency of sports, or when you have primary ovarian insufficiency, which basically, think of it like premature menopause, you're not making any of that estradiol. It's like being menopausal. And we don't believe that oral ethinyl estradiol is the best thing to protect your bones. We believe that transdermal estradiol is the best thing to protect your bones. So if you're somebody with one of those medical conditions, we would recommend those other approaches. However, there are some people who say, look, I want to be on the birth control pill because I don't want to risk getting pregnant. I don't want to use an IUD. I don't want to use these other things. And so you have to have these individual discussions in the office, right?
Is that, you said it's similar state to menopause.
Yeah.
Does that also ring true or stand for someone who is post-menopause, that transdermal estrogen is superior than oral with regards to protecting against osteoporosis?
No, it's because it's ethinyl estradiol. It's because it's the estrogen in the pill. So ethinyl estradiol was designed specifically to do a better job for suppressing ovulation so you don't get pregnant, right? And at the time, in the 60s and 70s, when they were doing the research, they didn't have the ability to make estradiol, the hormone that the ovaries release, in such a way that it could be taken orally in the doses. So just the technology didn't exist. So ethinyl estradiol was the hormone, and that's why they didn't use oral progesterone. They had to use progestin. So that's why you have wizards in chemistry, so they can design hormones that work. However, when you don't have any of your own estrogen, when you're in early menopause, oral ethinyl estradiol may not be the best thing for your bones. However, when you're in menopause, we don't give ethinyl estradiol because we don't need it. We don't need a super potent, strong estrogen. We're giving you estradiol transdermally or orally, or we're giving you Premarin, which is conjugated equine estrogens. And all of those are equally fine to protect your bones. So it's kind of the context and what's going on. We have studies with women in the menopause transition using the traditional birth control pill with ethinyl estradiol, and they don't have any higher risk of osteoporosis.
And they do that during the menopause transition to help, contraception and or help with symptoms?
Yeah. I mean, some people have catastrophic bleeding during their menopause transition. They got really heavy periods or the bleeding all over the place, and the pill's a great way to control that. Some people maybe have worse premenstrual dysphoric disorder or PMS during that time. Some people just want to take it for contraception. So there's different reasons to be on it. And if you're on it for those reasons, and you also happen to be getting hot flashes, then the ethinyl estradiol in the pill can also treat the hot flashes. So again, it has to be individualized. So the concern for osteoporosis is really limited to subset populations who have a medical condition, right? And for those people, it's not that the pill is bad. It's that ethinyl estradiol is not the optimal way to protect their bones.
Clear. Great distinction. What about cancer? Is it true that there is a slight increase in risk of breast cancer, a reduced risk of ovarian and endometrial? And if so, how do we kind of weigh all of that up?
Yeah, so there is a slight increased risk of breast cancer. But when you look at the overall risk, like when you're 20 and 30, your risk of breast cancer is so low, raising the risk slightly, raising a risk of 0.01% to a risk of 0.012%. I mean, those aren't the actual numbers, but you know what I mean.
Your absolute risk of developing breast cancer is tiny.
It's still very low. So can it happen to one or two people? Yes. Is it a major concern? I mean, obviously people look at things different ways, but no. We also know that it's highly protective against endometrial cancer, and it also reduces the risk of ovarian cancer. And so again, things have to be individualized. So for example, if you have somebody with polycystic ovarian syndrome, their risk for endometrial cancer is higher. So for that, and when those people are on, people with polycystic ovarian syndrome are on the estrogen-containing birth control pill, they're not only getting the benefits of the estrogen to lower their high androgens, but they're also getting protection against cancer of the uterus. And sadly, we see people coming in who need hormones to protect their uterus, who won't take it because of stuff they hear online. I see girls with super heavy periods that aren't controlled with non-hormonal medications that don't want to take, they're ignoring a whole class of medications because of these fears that they've had online, these fears from people who are selling you a supplement and selling you a coaching service. And it's very anger inducing because you feel really badly for these people because they've been led astray. They've had this bad information. And so the pill, if you look at life expectancy on the pill, I mean, the one risk we haven't talked about is there is also a real risk of blood clots with the birth control pill. And that's probably the major risk factor when we talk about serious risk factors. It's marginally increased, it's probably double over baseline depending on the pill that you're on. There's also, which none of these anti-pill people ever talk about how dangerous pregnancy is, ever. Most of them don't do abortions either, so they don't see the other consequences of what happens when people decided not to go on contraception. They didn't really want to be pregnant, but they weren't really given a good option, and then now they're pregnant. So there is actually an increased risk of breast cancer in pregnancy. It's a small, absolutely increased risk, but there is. Nobody talks about that. But the biggest risks with pregnancies are blood clots during pregnancy and in the postpartum period, maternal mortality, obviously, blood loss, damage to organs. If pregnancy were a medication, it would have the biggest fucking black box ever, right? Nobody ever talks about that. And, everybody has an individual risk-benefit ratio. And the nuances of talking about things in the office are often very much lost online. But, when I talk to somebody about risks and benefits, we're going through this whole gamut of everything. I'm not cherry picking one little thing to make my therapy sound different than it is.
When would the pill be contraindicated? Is there like if someone has a family history of breast cancer, or is it BRCA2 or BCRA?
No, it's not contraindicated there. So there's the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, and the WHO have a great document that people can go to. You can just Google WHO or CDC contraception guidelines. And they have this great chart, and they have all the medical conditions that are associated with concerns with the pill and all the contraceptives listed at top. And so you can look up each one. So you can see, I can't mention all of them here, but if you have a personal history of breast cancer, you shouldn't be on hormonal contraception. If you've had a blood clot in your legs or lungs, we're not going to give you hormonal contraception. If you have heart disease, well, we might not give you something with estrogen, but we may well be fine with you having something with progestin. And so for most of the situations, the risk of hormonal contraception is related to the estrogen, and it's related to the thrombogenic potential of estrogen. Just like in pregnancy, the thrombogenic potential of estrogen. So we get concerned when people have migraines with aura. And there might be some wiggle room depending on the specific situation. But migraines with aura, you have an increased risk of stroke. We think if you're on an estrogen-containing birth control pill. If you have advanced heart disease, we think you're at increased risk. So these are all things that increase your thrombogenic potential. So you either, if you have an estrogen receptor positive cancer or a hormone receptor positive cancer, if you have a thrombogenic concern, and also some liver disease. Those are kind of like the big three buckets. There's also a few other things as well. Advanced vascular disease, like with lupus or with diabetes. So, there's other things to think about too. So yeah, there absolutely are people who should not get the estrogen-containing birth control pill. People who are over the age of 35 who smoke.
Right. But that doesn't mean it's contraindicated for everyone.
Right. I mean, again, the internet is really bad for nuance. Just like pregnancy isn't safe for everybody. There are people who can't take, here's a great example. There are people who've had bariatric surgery, can't take non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. That doesn't mean those drugs are bad. It doesn't mean the people who can take them shouldn't take them, right? So it means that we should parse risk based on individual factors.
Context matters. What's the relationship between the pill and acne? My understanding is that it may protect against at least certain types of acne.
So the pill is a very effective form for acne. So a very effective treatment for acne. So when people have acne, especially, when they're younger or they have polycystic ovarian syndrome or even acne in the menopause transition, it's generally related to having an increased effect of androgens on your sebaceous glands, basically, right? So you're making more oil, you're getting more inflammation, getting more plugging. I mean, I'm not an acne expert, so if I haven't explained that correctly, don't write nasty things in the comments. But what we know is that an increased impact of androgens on the tissues is a big risk factor. And what the estrogen-containing birth control pill does is it increases sex hormone binding globulin, which is a carrier molecule for sex hormones. And testosterone, so I think about it as a bus. So sex hormone binding globulin, think about that as a bus. And both estrogen and progesterone want to get on the bus. And that's how it's driven around your body. And when it's off the bus, it's more active. When it's on the bus, it's not. Mm-hmm. And then there are sometimes people are hanging off the bus and they're sort of active, like teenagers do. So testosterone, and again, this is my analogy of how I remember it. Testosterone is a bully and it pushes its way onto the bus. So it binds more tightly to sex hormone binding globulin. So when you raise levels of sex hormone binding globulin, instead of equally attracting estrogen and testosterone, you attract more testosterone because it's the bigger bully. So you get more testosterone binding. So essentially, as far as your cells are concerned, you're lowering the amount of testosterone that can negatively affect the tissues. And that's how it improves hormonal acne.
Wow. That's a great analogy.
Isn't it? I call it, what did I call it? Seats on the bus, girls, sex hormone binding globulin. So yeah, I mean, it's like, it's just an analogy and it helps. It's a good way to remember it. So it's basically mopping up testosterone. So it's not having that effect. And that's one of the ways it's very helpful for people with polycystic ovarian syndrome, right? Because they have androgen excess. Mm-hmm. And so you can reduce those high levels of androgen, the way the androgen's affecting the tissue, by giving them estrogen.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Connecting a few dots there. What about this idea? I've heard this from a lot of people that the pill depletes the body of nutrients, that somehow it's kind of affecting the body's ability to either absorb nutrients or it's excreting nutrients. And therefore, if you're taking the pill, you'll need to supplement.
I've heard that tomatoes can cause a solar eclipse. I've heard that. I've really heard a lot of people say that. I haven't read any studies about it though, but I've heard people say that. So there are no studies to support that.
Have you come across that one though?
Oh yeah, you hear it all the time. It's just, it's sort of this, all these things are just sort of, it's again gets back to how do you refute things that haven't been studied? So what you can do is you can look at indirect evidence. So if the birth control pill caused people to be depleted of nutrients, then people who got pregnant right after being on the pill would have worse outcomes, right? We don't see that. They don't have a higher incidence of anemia. They have a higher incidence of problems. No one ever talks about how putting people on the birth control pill is a great way to treat iron deficiency anemia, which it is. So there's no evidence. If it depleted nutrients, then putting people on the pill to time infertility therapy would be less effective. So we don't have any what I would call secondary evidence to sort of support that. There's no safety signal to support that. It's a great way to sell your supplements, to treat the nutritional deficiencies, to sell your marked up, special multivitamins it's always so hypocritical to me that these people are saying that they have a special treatment for you, but they don't have any studies. They're just making something up. They're literally making something up. So I challenge those people to prove me wrong and do studies.
I get the feeling I know the answer or your response to this next quote that I'm going to put to you.
Okay.
We're bringing Mindy Peltz back. So Mindy said, so this is what women need to know. Your cycle is a detox. You are shedding the inner lining of your uterus and you are getting rid of what is not serving you. So it's not just a troublesome situation you have to deal with. Your body is getting rid of hormones. It's getting rid of toxins. It's how we detox. It takes a couple of years for the pattern of the brain and the ovaries to get to know each other. So if we come in with birth control, a year after a woman started her period, there's never an internal innate sense of the body. And then we keep women on birth control until menopause. And now she has a serious hormonal issue because she never learned that pattern.
Again, it's pretty clear they don't teach anything about reproductive physiology in chiropractic school. She's an example of that. So that really reflects a complete lack of understanding about the menstrual cycle. So first of all, humans don't have toxins. Toxins are substances made by plants, animals, and bacteria that are poisonous, like cobra venom, like, that octopus in Australia that no one should touch, right? The blue one, that one?
Blue-ringed octopus.
Yeah, that one. So those are toxins. Toxins, E. coli, bacteria can make toxins. So we don't have toxins. We have to get rid of toxins. The menstrual cycle is not a detox because humans don't need to detox. It's not a system of removing excess waste from your body. If it were, pregnancy would really be inconvenient, wouldn't it? If we really needed the menstrual cycle to dump things, how could people survive pregnancy? How could they survive menopause? Oh my God, I should be dead. I'm not menstruating anymore, oh my God. So totally not in the realm of medical science. People have actually studied hormone levels in menstrual blood. Your estrogen and progesterone, it's not different than the blood from your arm because it's the blood from your arm just coming out through your uterus. So there's that basic misunderstanding. Then there's the idea that it is true. So there's always a grain of truth in some of these things. In the first few years of your menstruation, as we spoke about earlier, your cycle is maturing. That's an analogy. It's not actually like maturing. It's just episodically firing. Things are getting up to speed, if you will. And so that's why the first few cycles aren't ovulatory. So often for 2 or 3 years, periods are very irregular. Your body's not learning from that. Your brain's not like, okay, I didn't ovulate this month. Let me write there's no learning. It's just how the system works. It takes a while for that to mature. It's not learning so then it can do it right. It's not like a practice thing. That's not how your body works.
Is there a concern, though, if you intervene with the pill that you affect that maturity?
No, if there were, then you'd see that with pregnancies at age 12 and 13 too, right? So again, no, because the system is happening. And this might be hard for people to understand. This system is happening. Your brain is maturing. Your ovaries are doing that very first cycle of getting those eggs ready each cycle, whether you're on hormones or not. That's happening.
I think there's this idea that everything is shut down.
It's not, yeah. The only thing that's shut down is the ability of follicles to respond. There's no FSH. So those follicles that show up ready to get recruited, they don't get recruited.
So it's just that step. And what you're saying is when you come off the pill, even if you've been on it for 10 years, even if you started it at age 12, that production of FSH. Sorry, I was getting confused with LH.
Yeah.
So there's LH and FSH. That production of FSH resumes again.
Right. Because if it didn't, we'd never get pregnant after a pregnancy. The whole system is designed to be shut down and come back online.
Is there ever a scenario where someone takes a pill and then they come off it and their body's not producing FSH?
That would be because they maybe developed primary ovarian insufficiency while they were on the pill, but it's not from the pill. That was something they were going to always develop, right? So the only thing that is going to damage your I don't want to use the term damage. I never like people who have conditions to think that way of themselves. If you're given chemotherapy, you damage those, let's use that word, you affect those follicles in that first part of the cycle. Those eggs in the waiting that are trying to come out each month, those can be poisoned by chemotherapy. So when you don't have those eggs to get recruited by FSH, well, then you have early menopause or primary ovarian insufficiency. But after chemotherapy, your FSH goes back online. So it all, it all goes back online.
Right, which is why fertility often comes up when someone is making the choice to start chemotherapy.
Right. So what we want to do is we want to try to, so many people now choose, if they have the financial resources, and it's really sad that that's a limiting step, they actually choose to harvest eggs and freeze them. Or if they, have access to sperm that interests them, then they can also freeze embryos, right? So we go to great pains to try to do that. But no, the FSH doesn't go offline and then not come back online because of the birth control pill. That's just not a thing. So it's always hard to explain things that aren't things. And I guess, if you've gone to medical school instead of chiropractic school, maybe you'd know that.
We're going completely off topic, but I have a quick question here, selfishly. If a man goes through chemotherapy, does that affect his sperm and sperm quality or potential ability to have a child?
Oh, Simon, I only have a personal interest in men, not an academic interest. I don't know what happens.
Okay. I can get someone else on the show to answer that question.
Yeah, I don't, unlike many experts on social media, I like to confine myself to the topics that I know a lot about.
I respect that. Good answer. Why don't we talk about emergency contraception? Right? That seems to be in your ballpark.
Sure.
Morning after pill. I think Plan B or Ella.
Yeah.
What do we understand about the efficacy and the safety of these drugs?
Very effective. Well, Ella much more effective than Plan B is effective. Ella is more effective. So
these are different types of drugs?
Yeah. So before I get to emergency contraception, I just want to sort of point something out. So you asked me a question about testes and sperm production. And I was like, I don't know, I'm not an expert, right? I'm a medical doctor. I actually read quite a bit about those things. I know a fair bit. And I probably could have taken a stab and answered your question and done pretty well. But I'm not an expert, and I shouldn't be speaking on that. So then it's always stunning to me when I hear chiropractors talking about prescription medications they would never have prescribed, and having such a confidence about it. Because here I am, I'm a medical doctor. I've done a 5-year residency. I've done a fellowship. I've been in practice for 30 years. And I know a lot about the body parts that I don't treat. Like I know a lot because I do a lot of reading. But I still said, you should ask a real expert.
Right. But for me, I hear that and I respect that. I'm like, okay, she appreciates uncertainty. She knows her limits. Right. So I'm like, okay, that's a huge tick. But on social media, someone could hear that and think she's not confident. She doesn't know her. She doesn't understand the topic enough.
Yeah. Well, so we all, I think, mistake confidence for accuracy. I mean, I think we all like confident people. And I just think it's really important that people understand what training sets you up for expertise, right? So if I started talking about airplane safety, if I started making TikToks about airplane safety and start talking about flaps and ailerons, and I've flown enough on planes and read enough articles that I could probably say some things that cherry pick a few words and stuff. People would say that's ludicrous because I don't know anything about that. So I think it's really important that people understand what training should set you up to be an expert in the field. There's a really great book written by, I think his name is Tom Nichols, called The Death of Expertise. And I think that it's really important for people to understand, what qualifies somebody as an expert on a subject to kind of have a discussion. And when I hear someone who could never prescribe a medication because that's, they don't learn that, talking about medication, how can they be an expert on that subject?
It gets confusing when they have doctor in front of their name.
Yeah, it does. I mean, most people don't understand. People don't understand the different. A lot of people think a naturopath is a medical doctor that just prescribes herbs, right? Well, they're not. They didn't go to medical school. Their training is far inferior. And that's part of a problem. That's a problem with our education system. It's a problem with explaining what actually is, what people can actually do. So I just think people need to have that information. I mean, I always say, if you are going on an airplane, I might have used this analogy before though. So,
But we can repeat it.
oh, we can repeat it?
Yeah.
Okay.
If someone hears it twice,
That's fine. Okay.
It's not a problem.
So if you're going on an airplane, do you want the pilot that only studied how planes fly with real physics and understand how they were in hours and hours of flight school? Or do you want the pilot that spent less time in flight school and his flight school also included how to fly magic carpets? Which pilot
I don't know.
do you
Magic
want?
carpets are pretty cool.
Pretty cool. Yeah. Yeah. So which person do you want? Do you want the person who was taught things that magic carpets are real? This whole concept in chiropractic care about these subluxations. I don't even know what they are. Like never been proven. Like it's, it's sort of this weird chiropractic term. I mean, do you want someone who, that's their basis, or a naturopath who believes in homeopathy? That they're taught that that's an actual real thing.
Right. But once again, a lot of, I think, people end up sourcing information from these people because the medical system has failed them.
I know, and I'm trying to fix that, right? Like I'm out there doing my best, swinging my bat. I'm like, I get it. I get it. I get how hard it is to be flooded with all this information about things that you don't know and uncertainties, and to show up in the office and to be sent away. And I'm so empathetic about all those things. And I just feel if people had a better understanding. So for example, if you knew all about the menstrual cycle, when you hear someone saying, well, you need the menstrual cycle to get rid of toxins and hormones, then you'd be able to say, block, next.
Yeah, these are not mutually exclusive. You can be failed by the medical system and still be victim or vulnerable to misinformation.
Right. Oh, absolutely. And, I often see people, on my Instagram, making, well, what else are we supposed to do? We have to go to these things because medicine won't help us. And I always give the quote that I wish I'd come up with this, but Ben Goldacre, who is a physician from the United Kingdom, and he said, when there's a problem with the airline industry, the answer isn't to invest in magic carpets. So I'm not investing in magic carpets. I'm trying to fix the industry, right? And so the answer to not getting care for your symptoms isn't to tell someone that it's because you were on the pill for 5 years and that you should take my special hormones and have this blood test done or urine test done every year. The answer is to make medicine listen to that person and to try to understand why they have their symptoms in the framework of science.
And your point about knowing your limits, that reminds me, a friend of mine, he's a poet. He has this line where he says, we need to repopularize saying, I don't know.
Absolutely. And I just want to say, I really understand what it's like to be in a no man's land or no woman's land or no person's land, however we want to say it, of information. My son, who's 20, they're both 20, he's having open heart surgery in 3 weeks. And he's an adult with congenital heart disease. And, when you talk with the doctors and surgeons about things, you realize that there isn't a lot of information to go on because 50 years ago, all the kids like him were dead. Right? So there aren't 30 years of information, aren't 20 years of information. You're right on this cusp of people figuring things out, how to treat people, because they were never in a position to be able to treat people.
That's a scary position, or must be a scary position to find yourself in.
Well, we have great experts. I really feel like he's got incredible experts that are caring for him, who've explaining things to us in detail, who take the time when we have the questions. And so but I understand what it's like to not be able to look something up and have a pat answer, because there are times medicine doesn't. The science hasn't always caught up with the symptoms. The science, in 50 years' time, we might be able to say, oh, that's what that was. I mean, look, when I was 12, I ruptured my spleen and they had to do an angiogram to find out because ultrasounds hadn't been invented. And now, be barbaric to consider that, right? So you think about the evolution of medicine, and it's really hard because we all want all that information to be there for us right at this moment. But we also have to accept that Everything is evolving and science changes. And all of those things are really difficult because when science changes, it makes people think that maybe it was wrong, but that's just the scientific method. And so, I understand what it's like to be sitting in a doctor's office and to have information that's complex and to not have all the answers. But again, I think to get back to the magic carpet analogy is my son's doctors have invested in telling us all the information, to being really open, to listening to everything. And that goes a long way to fix those gaps.
Mm-hmm. Being able to listen.
Being able to listen and being able to sit with it and, being able to answer questions to the best of the ability, So, it's...
But the medical system needs to change quite a bit for everyone to kind of have that experience.
Well, if you have 8 minutes or 12 minutes with your doctor, how do you have that experience? When you have a $100 copayment and you can't afford it, how do you have that experience? So there's so many things to fix. It's really sad to see the answer coming up as supplements. You know what I mean? Because that's
almost though as if that is it's the hope that people need, right? If they're not getting the answers from their primary practitioner or don't have the time with them and they just feel like they haven't got an answer, at least what other people are putting forward is giving them a sense of hope.
I'd say it's false hope, right? And what I find really, again, I sort of touched on this earlier, is when you hear somebody say, oh, well, the birth control pill causes hormonal depletion or causes nutritional depletion. There are no good studies to support that. And then they're going to turn right around and give you a supplement that hasn't been studied. Like, what hypocrisy? Wait. So you're saying that there's not enough studies here and that's bad. Oh, but there aren't enough studies with your product. There are no studies with your product. Oh, not at all. And it's not even batch tested or purity tested or whatever. But that's an answer? So I just think that...
It's a double standard.
It's a terrible double standard.
And it plays into the idea that, Big Pharma doesn't have your best interests, but supplement companies do.
I mean, capitalism doesn't have your best interests. That's why we need regulation. And, there's lots of fantastic... I know somebody who's a top chemist at a pharmaceutical company. He's super smart. All he wants to do is come up with new, great, crazy molecules. He wants to break molecules in a lab and make new ones and, make the world a better place. And that's fantastic. The shareholders might be different, right? But, I think that many pharmaceutical companies, and we've seen this in the past, if they were allowed to do whatever they wanted to do, they would do it. But that's why we have regulations. And we just don't have that with, supplements or probiotics or things like that. So you can do whatever you want as long as you don't claim it treats a disease.
Let's come back to the morning after pill.
Sorry, you can cut all of that if it was too much of a...
No, we will not be cutting any of that, Dave. I'm looking at you. Morning after pill.
Yes.
Plan B, Ella. Are these medications effective? Are they safe? How are they different?
Yeah, so Plan B is levonorgestrel, which is a progestin. That's one of the hormones that's also in the hormonal IUD, the birth control pill, similar to what's in the implant. And then ulipristal acetate, which is Ella. But we'll call them Plan B and Ella because it's easier. And both of them stop the LH surge. So they prevent ovulation. So if we go back to how we talked about the menstrual cycle at the beginning, you have those initial follicles getting ready, their 300-day incredible journey. Then you have the group that's ready, that can potentially get receptive to FSH, and a few start developing, and then there's one lead one. It's the surge of LH that triggers that final ovulation and the release of the egg. And what levonorgestrel does and what ulipristal acetate does are stop the LH surge. So it just prevents ovulation from happening. That's it.
So if there is sperm there, there's no egg for them to meet up with and have a party.
Exactly. And that's why people have a hard time with these medications. And I get it because they're like, well, why do we give it every day of the month? Like if you show up on day 20, I might have ovulated. You might have, but we don't know for sure. And because of that 5-day window, and so we just don't know.
5-day window being how long the sperm are hanging
Yeah,
around
exactly,
for.
right.
So that's, you have to act within that 5 days.
Right. Well, so with the morning after pill and with with ulipristal acetate, with levonorgestrel and
Big
ulipristal
names.
acetate. I know, right? I feel like it's like a drinking game, but
Plan B
not.
and L is
Yeah,
a
Plan
lot
B and
easier.
L. We'll do that. So if they are given after ovulation happens, they don't do anything. Plan B has a shorter window in which it can act on ovulation, so that's why Ella is more effective. So it's got a longer window for which it can do its job. So if you have already ovulated, they're not going to work. So
Right,
that's
so
why we
if
still
you
see
just
some
happen
pregnancies.
to have had unprotected sex, you've already ovulated, it could be too late
It
even
would be too
having
late.
the morning
They
after
wouldn't
pill.
do anything. Yeah.
Okay.
So, but that's a pretty narrow window. So the whole goal is that you're trying to prevent pregnancy for all the people who haven't quite yet ovulated. And we give it on every day of the month because, well, what if something delayed your cycle and you're ovulated late, right? So we don't know. Most people aren't tracking that well that they'd be able to tell. So that's how they work. And they're not abortifacients. All they do is prevent, they are literally contraception. That's why they're called.
Abortifacients, something that
Triggers an
causes
abortion.
or induces an abortion.
Yeah. So they don't affect, all they do is affect the egg and the sperm meeting. They don't affect if there's been conception, if there's been a blastocyst, no effect after that point.
Because their effect is on FSH.
LH.
Sorry, LH. Getting confused here.
It's okay. It's a lot of, there's a lot of different, that, look, I mean, we've had this in detailed discussion about this, and it's still complex because, you're learning. So imagine then how bad these 60-second videos can be to get right. Like how, because it is complex. Because, if it's not your area of expertise, just like if I saw a 60-second video about an airplane, I'd be like,
Yeah, it's going to take much more than one conversation to kind of fully understand this. That's right. There's a plug for the book. Is there any risks at all with taking the morning after pill, be it one off or if you're doing it repeatedly?
no. I mean, no. It's pretty safe as far as medications go. I mean, the thing that I would say is that especially Plan B, taking it repetitively, it's not that great as a contraceptive. Like it's good. It's better than nothing. It's a good Plan B. But you're better off using a hormonal contraceptive as a hormonal contraceptive than taking, Plan B like once a month, that type of thing. So it just depends on how badly you don't want to be pregnant too. And
What's Plan A? Wearing a condom.
Well, Plan A is condoms and hormonal contraception. And I think what's also often missing from these discussions, again, the 60-second clips online don't work, is there are different degrees of needing to not be pregnant, right? And there are different degrees of contraceptive effectiveness. So if I can't be pregnant, no way, no how, this would be the most catastrophic thing for me ever in the whole wide world, we have long-acting reversible contraception. So the implant and IUDs, highly effective. And then we have things that work pretty well, but they have more user error in them. So birth control pills, the Depo-Provera shot, they work really well, but it's hard to take a pill every day. And it's hard sometimes people aren't able to get in for an appointments for their shots. So, they work well, but not as well, but work well. And then there's things that work less well that have more user dependency to them, like condoms. If a condom doesn't break and you use it all the time, and so the perfect taking is obviously often different than the real world. And that's why long-acting reversible contraception is so good, because the perfect and the real world are the same. There's no snowstorm that stops you to go to the doctor's office to get a refill. There's no pharmacy that closed early. There's no, all these things that could potentially, there's no way that the IUD can metabolize differently, So there's,
Right.
it takes away lots of things that can affect efficacy.
Speaking of IUD, is it also true that when it comes to emergency contraception, you could have a copper or a hormonal IUD inserted into the uterus.
Yeah, absolutely.
Within a certain period as well.
So they're even more effective, especially the copper IUD. It's the most effective morning after contraceptive because it kills the sperm. So
how does that work?
copper is toxic. Well, it killed the sperm. That's a bad analogy. It affects sperm capacitation,
Wow.
which is some final step that the sperm, again, I'm not an expert, the sperm has to go through to penetrate the egg. So that's what copper does. It's highly toxic to it.
It's interesting. I always thought that the copper IUD was some type of physical goalie that would like get in the way and kind of stop like the balls or the sperm getting through, like a goalie.
That's not a bad analogy. I mean, it's
wrong.
It's stopping the. Well, analogies are analogies. It's okay. Apparently the guy who discovered that copper was toxic to sperm, his name is Dr. Zipper. I don't know why, but I love that name. I love that.
It's very ironic.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like, I don't know. I just really like that. That's sort of one of these like symmetry things. That's something that just pleases me and I have no explanation.
But the copper's not toxic to the person with a uterus in any way.
No, it's not. Unless you have something called Wilson's disease, which is a disorder of copper metabolism. So it's not very common, but you don't want to take extra copper if you have, Wilson's disease. And the other thing with the copper IUD is it can increase menstrual flow a little bit. So if somebody's got super heavy periods, that might not be the best option. But again, these are all things that are nuanced in the office. You might have someone who says, well, I don't want to take hormones. They just don't want to. I don't care that if my period's a little bit heavier, I'm willing to take that risk. With information, then people can make choices that work for them and accept everybody's risk-benefit ratio with things are different. So that's why the more information you have, the more you can fine-tune that risk-benefit ratio for you.
Is the morning after pill expensive?
Well, I suppose it depends where you live. So I don't actually know how much it costs here. I think it's provided free a lot of places, college campuses and stuff. Ella is more expensive, and that one is probably not provided free in some places, but it might be. I think there's probably some student health services that have it. I mean, it really is the more effective product. And one thing about Plan B, the levonorgestrel, is we think that it may be less effective for people with a higher body weight. And unfortunately, I don't think we have the definitive study to tell us, but so people who, have a body mass index over 30 probably would want to get Ella regardless.
Okay. You mentioned abortifacients. So let's talk a little bit here about abortion. Why the decision to have a chapter on abortion in a book that's kind of dedicated to the menstrual cycle?
Well, in the good old days, we used to call abortion menstrual regulation. So I think part of it's homage to that. And I think when I first started, I hadn't really planned on it, but then the anti-abortion stuff in the United States just seemed to pick up fever status basically. And I was seeing this cascade of events and I thought, I've got to put it in there. People need to have that information. They need to know much more about it. And, hopefully this is something that people then could also read and be like, okay, now I know my politician is full of it and I have more information to challenge them and to say things. So
not one to shy away from some controversial topics.
Well, I think that, by including it in the book, I'm saying it's not controversial, right? I'm saying it's just part of everything.
Yeah.
And so I think that normalizing things, having them in things where you can see it. When you hide something, when you don't talk about it, it makes it seem like it's bigger, scarier, shameful. And I think that in addition to the power that comes with knowledge, it's also a cleansing. This is probably the only good use of the word cleanse in medicine is kind of, shining a light on everything, bringing it out in the open so people aren't left going to the darker corners of the internet for information.
Yeah, you say it's not controversial, but it is, I guess, polarizing. So what are the things that you wish more people knew about abortions?
Oh, well, I mean, part of the problem with the discussion about abortion is lots of people have so much, disinformation and misinformation about it. If you really cared about reducing the abortion rate, if you said, yep, that's super important to me, that's why I'm voting for this politician, then you want the politician who's going to fund contraception. You would want the politician that's going to fund community health centers. You'd want the politician that's going to fund education. Because when people have access to highly reliable contraception and it's free, the abortion rate drops.
So how do you take the position that you're against abortion, but you're also against oral contraception, whilst being logically consistent? Like, how are they taking that position?
Well, you can't be. I mean, you're a forced birther at that point, right? So you're someone who doesn't, you're someone who wants to take agency away. And I think that most of the forced birth rhetoric in the United States is just simply, hidden misogyny, or not even hidden, open misogyny. So it's this idea that women are dirty if they have sex outside of marriage, that women should not be in the workplace. You should be at home. You should be at home looking after children. You should have this sort of, it's not a coincidence, I think, that we're seeing this rise of the trad wife movement on TikTok at the same time as we're seeing this rise of abortion misinformation and birth control misinformation, right?
What's it called?
Oh, trad wife.
I'm not spending enough time on TikTok.
Well, you don't want to be in that corner. Basically, where you're, embracing not just being a stay-at-home spouse, and there is nothing wrong with that, but you're embracing that you're going to be making every single thing from scratch, and you're going to be, spending hours in the kitchen. Basically, it's glamorizing what
traditional gender roles kind of.
Yeah, but traditional gender roles like from the 1800s. Like, if you are making bread in the 17 or 1800s, you're not going to the store to buy flour.
What's behind that movement?
Well, I think a lot of it's funded by the right wing in the United States.
So it's political.
Yeah, I think so. I'm not up to date on all the political funding, but I read an article about that there's a lot of dark money behind that, because it's very much the whole goal is to keep women away from the workplace, right? So the people who are anti-abortion and anti-contraception are pro-punishing women. I mean, these are the states where women aren't getting care because they're pregnant and miscarrying, and maybe they've had a fetal demise, or maybe the fetus isn't dead yet, but it's going to be, and they're getting sick, and no one will do anything about it because the doctors are afraid about getting arrested. If you cared about life, you wouldn't be doing that. So this is all a way to hide misogyny, or it's about power and control, and it's not about health. And that's why I think we really need to be calling these people out, because if you wanted to save lives, you would want abortion to be legal and safe and affordable, if not free, because in countries where it used to be illegal and then goes illegal, maternal mortality drops dramatically. I give the example of South Africa in the book, and I can't remember the statistics off the top of my head, but dramatic reduction when abortion became legal.
It seems to be like, where are you placing value on life? Is it the mother, or is it the baby?
Yeah, well, you're saying that somebody who's pregnant has no value. They have no agency. You're replaceable. You're of no value. In Canada, there's no abortion law. It was struck off the books in 1988, I believe. The abortion rate hasn't gone up. It's just treated as a medical procedure, right? It's not legal. It's not illegal, just in the same way that taking your gallbladder out isn't legal or illegal, right?
Are you still practicing now?
Yeah, I still. Yeah, I don't provide abortion care anymore. Fortunately, we have lots of other people who do that.
But what would you do if you were living in a state practicing, like overseeing or doing abortion care, and it was made illegal?
Well, I moved. So I used to live in Kansas, and I provided abortion services in Kansas. And when I first moved to Kansas, there was no gestational age limit. It was one of the few states. So I did lots of procedures for people of very advanced gestational ages who had to travel from other states that had restrictions. And
which means that they can have an abortion at any point in time up until the 9-month mark.
Yeah. And of course, those are few and far between, and they're always, or in my experience, they were always catastrophic situations, really catastrophic, severe fetal abnormalities detected late in the pregnancy. And you could kind of understand how someone doesn't want to wait another 12 weeks, right? You can understand that. I mean, if you have empathy, you can understand that anyway. So those were the situations that I faced, abortions also at 18, 19 weeks for people who didn't realize they're pregnant, but I totally fine. Yeah, whatever. If you need an abortion, you need it. And I say need, not want, because want and need are the same here. So what happened was they changed the law in Kansas. They did, at the time, I worked at KU Medical Center. And there was all this complex stuff that I don't understand to do with how the medical center was funded. And to get out from underneath the state funding, because, the hospital was going under, they needed a law to be passed so they could basically purchase I don't understand the specifics of it. And what some awful forced birther did is he put a rider on the law that no abortions could be done at KU Medical Center. So for the hospital to survive, to whatever financially survive, this is what I was told, that was it. That's what happened. So, I'm the person there doing the abortions for the people who are sick with sepsis and fetal demise and doing, all these things. And now I'm told I can't. And then people would call me up and they say, oh, I'm a cardiologist. Oh, I'm a nephrologist. I have this patient who's super sick and she needs an abortion. And I'm just like, where were you at the community meetings when we were talking about how devastating this would be, And so there was a situation where somebody really did need one, really, to satisfy. So the law was basically, you got to be like actively dying, but you want to give medical care before you're actively dying, right? You don't want to be waiting for death to be unhooking the IV. You want to be a few steps before that. So we had a situation, and the hospital lawyers said I couldn't do it. And if I did, they would fire me. And you have to remember, your malpractice insurance doesn't cover you for getting arrested by the state.
And you might lose your license.
Yeah, all these things, right? And you think you're going to get a fair trial in a state. So there's all these things, right? So what I did was, with the hospital attorney's permission, was called that politician at home and got his permission for the abortion.
Wow.
And I was all prepped, and I had read everything about this person's medical condition. Her physician had, grilled me. I was like, I'm going to answer every question. I was like going in for an exam because I'm going to bat for this woman.
And what was the main reason for the abortion?
Oh, I can't remember now at this point. But it was definitely to save an organ. Mm-hmm. And I started, and I didn't get more than 4 words out, a sentence maybe at the most. And he said, oh, doctor, do whatever you think is best. So if whatever I thought was best was the operation of the day, why did we have that law? Well, you have that law because writing awful laws about abortion is a great way to raise funds as a politician. Nothing seems to get out the base than punishing women. That's why those laws exist. All these stories of all these women coming into parking lots and having sepsis and not getting their care because of these laws. You could have 100,000 of them and it wouldn't move these people because they don't care. It's a political agenda. And that's why, when I always see people sharing their stories and they think, oh, this is going to move people. No, it's not. Because if those stories moved people, they'd already be moved. They wouldn't have those laws. They don't care. And then we have nurses and doctors calling police on people. It's awful in some states. So yeah, when that was the final straw for me at the University of Kansas, and I was like, I can't live here, and I have to move. So I did. I was lucky enough to be in that situation.
So what's the law in Canada? Like, is it up to a certain number of weeks, or what's the context where abortion can take place?
Anytime. Now, you have to find someone who can do it. And I don't mean that means that there's incredible abortion access in every province. So I think, for example, in Prince Edward Island, they don't believe they have an abortion provider. And if you live in Northern Canada, if you're in a small town, so there's
And does it have to be a
issues.
medical reason? So for the mother, or there's a development issue with the fetus? No.
And funny enough, when that happens, there aren't all these people, so the Republicans in the United States make it as if there's all these women coming at 38 weeks for buy one, get one abortions with their pals. Oh, I didn't realize I was pregnant. wonder why my clothes weren't fitting. Gosh, now that I know that I'm 38 weeks, I'm going to go have an abortion. Like, that's literally what they're trying to paint people as. That's not what happens. It's really important for people to understand that when people have later procedures, which obviously this isn't what it's about in many states, it's usually because of a very complex constellation of medical issues, right? So
what do you think this looks like in 20 years?
I don't know. I think the problem in the United States is the Supreme Court. So you could get Democrats all through, and I'm not a politician, so I might not understand the laws appropriately or how that happens, but you can pass any law you want, and then someone can challenge it and take it to the Supreme Court. And if the Supreme Court is basically bought and paid for, you get thrown out, right? I mean, that's what happened. With Roe versus Wade, they waited to a point where they had enough justices on the Supreme Court, and someone filed a case, and it managed to wind its way through the system because of strategic political appointments for judges, wind its way through the system and got in front of people who you knew were going to do what they did.
Have you ever had a debate with someone that's pro-life? Do you think that debates are useful?
No, not at all. It's because they're not honest about the issue. Because if they were truly pro-life, they'd be out there funding long-acting reversible contraceptive clinics.
Is that a generalization that most pro-life people are against the oral contraception, or is that just a fact that most people who are against abortion seem to also be against the pill?
No, I think we're seeing a biased selection of the people who are vocal. Right. So I think that the type of person who makes TikToks and screams in the government and state politics, I think that yes. But I think that's also because they get votes and they get attention. Maybe some of them really don't believe in it. I think that most people probably don't. I don't actually have the data, so I can't really say. But the hypocrisy here is, if reducing abortions is really your goal, well, we can reduce a lot of them. We can't reduce the ones that are because of chromosomal abnormalities or maternal health reasons or domestic violence reasons, or just because somebody didn't have access to contraception. But you know what? We can reduce the rate pretty significantly. There's studies that show it. Make contraception free and easily available, because the most effective forms of contraception are the most expensive ones. Right? So that also then creates an imbalance. So make them free, make them available. You can achieve a goal. So that's obviously not the goal. More sex education, more all kinds of things, right? But so the goal is punishment. The goal is this warped version of individual responsibility. The goal is punishing people because it gets votes and gets attention. It can't be about what they're saying. So why would you debate with someone who's not there in good faith? Right? So for them to have a good faith argument, they would have to accept that there should be government funding of long-acting reversible contraception clinics. They should have that. But their goal isn't to reduce abortion. Their goal is to make it impossible so people suffer.
Jen, thank you so much for joining me today again. Coming down, spending this time with us. It's been fun. It's been serious, everything in between.
I know, everything in between. I hope I didn't yammer on too much.
No, you did great. I want everyone to go out and get a copy of Blood, The Science, Medicine and Mythology of Menstruation in all good bookstores. Canada, UK, Australia, USA.
New Zealand, yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
I've got the Canadian.
That's the Canadian one.
Version,
yes.
Which we discussed prior to hitting record, has the same spelling as Australian English, yes, or British English.
Yes.
Which is the correct way to use English.
Yes. So if you want the correct, all the correct spelling, if you want all your U's, mm-hmm, then you want to get the Canadian or the UK version. And the UK is the one that you can get in Australia and New Zealand. If you're okay with not having the U's, then you want the
I want
the
my
US
U's.
version. You want your U's?
Thank you so much. We appreciate you.
Thanks.
There you have it, friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and want to stay up to date with future episodes, be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow on Apple or Spotify. Finally, thank you for showing up and the effort that you're making to take control of your health. I look forward to hanging out with you again in the next episode.